100 years ago, the forces of Qi were resurrected. A ferocious fowl has risen up, endangering the kingdom of men. But, to the great fortune in people awakened extraordinary abilities, the first awakened fought desperately against evil. So they founded 4 great outposts to protect the people together. Yusheng has lived in Moge, a crime-ridden city, since he was a young boy. There were almost always fights, often with fatal consequences. Somehow, he developed an incredible talent. 9 patterns. 9 was incredible. Practically no one had ever had that many. Sometimes the young man's behavior was very unusual. He could pick up the phone and call the police to inform the police that there will be a sexual offense at 8 p.m. tonight at Sophie's Hotel, room 302, and that the sex buyer is his father. He also possessed extraordinary agility. If he met hooligans on the street, they could not outmaneuver him. A bully tried to pounce on a guy with a stick. With that, Yusheng deftly dodged the blow. Could have easily disarmed the perpetrator by slashing his hand with a sharp object. The striker immediately dropped his stick to the floor, and he started screaming unbearably. His arm was cut open. He had no desire to attack anyone anymore. Yusheng always carried items that would help him deal with bullies who attacked him. He also attracted attention easily. His teacher was confident that the young man could surprise him. The teacher pointed his finger at the window where Yusheng was passing by at that moment, and told someone that this guy should be of interest. He's not as simple as he looks at first glance. A young man who was born in a crime-ridden city, a hope in the struggle of the people who he will grow up to be. It was already getting dark outside. The lights were shining in Yusheng's house. There was a note on his father's desk with the name of the hotel and the room number 302. Yu Sanshui, the young man's father, was going somewhere. He was making himself up in front of the mirror. He was wearing a fresh suit. He was combing his hair. You could see he was trying to look his best. You could tell he was going on a date with some hottie. He was daydreaming about something and said that at 40, a man is like wine. The final touch to be irresistible was the application of perfume. The father pressed the perfume atomizer several times. The jet was directed to the neck area. At the same time, he turned his head to his son and said that food was on the table. When the young man wanted to eat, he should heat it up for himself. The young man nodded. At that, he was very enthusiastic. He was reading the book Moga's Legislation. Dad was just about to leave. He opened the door. He also asked his son not to stay out late, because Yusheng had an important exam tomorrow. As you know, in order to pass the exam, you must prepare well and get a good night's sleep. The young man said that he knew everything. He would prepare and would not stay up late. The man blurted out in a giveaway mood that he had gone on a date. He hoped his son would do well in the exam. The young man was reading a book. He was concentrating. The door behind his father closed loudly. The boy shuddered. His father had already left. On his mobile phone, the guy dialed a combination of numbers. He called the police. Yusheng told police officers that a sexual offense would take place at 8 p.m. tonight at Sophie's Hotel, room 302. The policeman asked him if he was sure he had seen the room number. The young man confirmed that he was 100% sure that the number was correct. The policeman asked the young man how they were related to the man who would come to the room. He replied that it was his father. It was all right, he thought. He hadn't framed his father at all. He was just serving the people because it was his duty, and it had to be legal. He sat down at the table to refresh himself. He started to remember that there would be an awakening ceremony tomorrow. The boy wasn't sure if he could actually open the patterned egg. He couldn't understand where it came from in his head. It was like a scroll of the dead. He wondered if anything would change after he woke up. Half an hour later, there was a mountain of dirty dishes in the sink. The young man sat on the sofa and read the book intently. He saw that a policeman was calling his phone. The young man thought the policeman had dialed by accident and picked up the phone. Yusheng took the call and answered. Swear words could be heard in the receiver. It was his father. The police had him in custody. He was upset that he was having such bad luck. He asked him to take the money quickly and come to the station to post bail. His father was just shouting into the phone. The young man held the mobile phone in his outstretched hand so as not to go deaf. The father could be heard perfectly well, even without holding the mobile phone to his ear. He shouted that there was a key under the bed in his bedroom. They needed to open the back door of the neighboring house where Widow Wang lives. The money is right under the vat of billets. The young man mumbled something inaudible. He did exactly as his father said. took the key under the bed, opened the door of the neighboring house, and under the vat of billets, he did find money. The boy carefully counted the notes. Yu Sheng counted 2,000. I put the money in my pocket and called the policeman again. He introduced himself and said he was a relative of Yu Sanshui. He also said that he would not post bail. After all, breaking the law should be punished. He also asked that his father be rehabilitated and make him a useful member of society. The boy reiterated that the police would make his father a useful member of society. After all, it had always been a positive force that Moga had spread. Everyone should honor and protect those fundamentals. Yu Sheng was running down an alley. A girl was running beside him. She was begging not to be caught. Suddenly, arrows flew at them. One arrow would have hit the young man in the eye. They ran and tried to dodge the arrows flying at them. Someone behind me was telling the boys to run faster. The boy and the girl ran up against the wall. The wall was high. It was tangled with barbed wire on top. It was impossible to get over it. It was a dead end. There was nowhere else to go. Behind them stood a group of guys armed with baseball bats. They shouted for the guy and the girl to keep running. There was nowhere to run to. A guy with a pumped-up torso, a chain around his neck, and a mohawk exclaimed. What did he think? Or did the fugitives want to leave their city of Zui? That was his dream. The guy with the mohawk gave the command to slaughter the fugitives, and a group of guys with knives in their hands and snide smiles ran straight at the guy and the girl. The fugitives also grabbed a knife each from behind their belts. A bloodbath ensued. The bodies of the boys were flying all over the place. There was a lot of blood. In a pool of blood lay the guy with the mohawk who gave the instructions. The girl and the guy were standing side by side. Around them lay the bodies of the couples. They were each holding a knife with traces of blood on it. The girl told the guy that he could leave. The guy had a card in his hand. He was thinking. The card had the word passage written on it. Suddenly, a passage opened in front of him. A light was falling from the passage. The boy went into the light. Yu Sheng opened his eyes and propped himself up on the bed. He was in his own bed. And this fight with the guys was just a scary dream he had. Perhaps one of his past life episodes had come to him in a dream, when he was still living in a crime-ridden city. The guy sighed in relief and looked out the window. He's got a test at school today. The boy slowly weaved his way to his studies. He heard his classmates talking. One of them said that he had been so worried yesterday that he hadn't slept a wink. Another guy replied that he was the same way, just doesn't know if he'll be able to wake up and get the patterned ones out. The guy was on his way to an exam. The exam was held in the preparatory class. The class teacher, Liu Qingfeng, said that the awakening exam would start in an hour. He continued, perhaps now the disciples were hoping to awaken themselves and pull out a good talent. He told the disciples to try and toughen themselves up, then kill the unclean, conquer the city, and gain everyone's respect. He clenched his hand into a fist, asked to drown his enemies in their blood, to help people prosper, and of course, to make himself respected. But if the disciples are going to end up behind, serving the people, then why bother trying at all? The disciples began to enthusiastically repeat, to help people prosper, to serve the people. Yu Sheng was mentally out of the audience, so he repeated, to serve the people or the people being served. The teacher looked angrily at the student and mentally called the boy a bastard. The teacher looked at his watch. He said it was already time. He asked the disciples to go to the awakening point. The teacher looked at Yu Sheng's footsteps. He was very curious to see how many patterns this bastard would awaken. At school, the exam has started. The students lined up in 3 rows. They took turns passing through a metal detector to identify metal objects. Similar detectors are located at airports to check luggage and passengers before boarding a flight. Each student walked under the metal detector. If the machine started beeping, there was a metal object in their pocket or on their clothes. It could be a coin in a pocket, a chain around the neck, earrings, and so on. Only after the check could the student be admitted to the exam. The girl walked over to the equipment and brought her hand up. 4 patterns opened up. It was cool. The girl was happy. One of the teachers was recording the results. He told the girl that she had a good talent. If a force system hatched, she could join the police department, and added that she could take it easy from here. Since the Qi resurrection, the animals have become bigger and stronger. Humans have also awakened extraordinary powers. During the awakening, an egg appears behind the person. The patterns on it determine the abilities of the awakened one. The maximum number of patterns that one disciple can receive is 9. and the one who awakens all the patterns will become the greatest of the living. The teacher called the next student to pass the metal detector. It was Yu Sheng. He walked over to the detector. The light bulb on the machine turned red, and a distinctive sound was heard. The teacher asked the young man if he was carrying any metal objects. The young man said that he always carried a couple of knives for self-defense. The teacher demanded that Yu Sheng take them out. After all, the awakening equipment was very expensive, and metal could affect the result of the test. Therefore, it was necessary to get rid of all metal objects before taking the test. The young man agreed. He started pulling out knives and other self-defense items from his belt, sleeves, and pockets. There were a lot of them. The teacher had a surprised look on his face. He asked if there was anything else in the pockets. The student said no. The classmates were whispering behind him. They were wondering who this guy was who was hiding so many weapons. Yu Sheng approached the detector once again. A distinctive sound was heard again. The teacher again asked if he had anything else. The boy thought for a moment and answered that perhaps the detector was catching his iron will. The teacher, raising his voice, ordered him to take everything out. The guy took off his jacket and shook out the remaining iron. He replied that there was definitely nothing else metal on him right now. Not even any trump cards left, he added mentally. This time, the detector missed him. He walked over to the equipment and put his hand up to it. Putting his hand on the balloon, the device began to emit light. An egg appeared behind the guy's back, and it had 9 patterns on it. Unbelievable. A whole 9 patterns, the maximum number of patterns. Everyone looked at the student with astonishment. The teacher could not believe his eyes. He intermittently repeated the result. Yu Sheng said that the equipment was most likely broken, and the result was false. The teacher refuted the student's words. The equipment was not broken. It was working properly. At that minute, the guy hit the equipment with his fist, and it shattered. The teacher was very surprised. The apprentice, after smashing the expensive equipment, once again repeated that it was broken. And this time, it was true. Smoke was rising from the equipment. Suddenly, the class teacher grabbed the student's arm. He said the young man had defaced public property and asked him to come with him. They stepped back, and the teacher showed the student a glow. The glow looked like a big blue firebird. They were already sitting on the firebird. The teacher was standing nearby. Yu Sheng didn't understand what that would mean. The firebird soared high above the school and flew into the distance. The young man sat on it and looked at how the students who stood on the field were very, very small. The same scroll that appeared to him, mostly in his dreams, appeared before his eyes. I wondered if he was the one who had reacted that way. Yu Sheng was called to the headmaster's office. Behind the desk sat the headmaster with glasses. A secretary stood next to him. The teacher and the student stood across the table. The principal began to read the student's file. It stated that the student had entered their school 6 months ago. He was now 18 years old. The principal looked sternly at the young man and asked, "Is he really from the criminal city?" The class teacher and secretary were also surprised that he was from a crime-ridden city. Yu Sheng thought for a moment. According to his data, if the scroll is indeed revealed during awakening, then what kind of power is this? The young man didn't know what it meant. The class teacher pulled the student back. The headmaster was talking to him, but Yu Sheng stood immersed in his thoughts and didn't hear anything. The young man mentally went back to the room to see the principal. The principal hesitated for a moment. The guy's 9-patterned egg manifested. He was undoubtedly the lucky one, but he was from a crime-ridden city. The headmaster, after thinking, turned to the young man again. He asked a strange question. If he woke up 6 times, or even 9 times, what would he do? The disciple replied that he would serve the people. The principal clarified whether this guy was really from the crime city. After all, his thoughts were very high. The principal kept asking questions. He asked what the boy used to do before he came to this school. The boy thought for a while and answered. Yesterday his father went to prostitutes, and he personally reported the incident to the police. Does that count as an answer to the question? The principal was covered in cold sweat. The secretary, who was standing behind the principal, began to laugh. The principal asked the boy to forget everything they were talking about. He should get some rest first. And the principal also asked the boy not to tell anyone about the results of the awakening. And he added that he would think about what to do with his studies. The boy thanked the director, said goodbye, and headed for the exit. The principal saw the young man off, thinking that he had managed to get out of the criminal city with such good skills. The guy walked up to his house. He grasped the doorknob with his hand. There were traces of blood on the handle. The boy surmised that someone had probably broken into his house. Yu Sheng walked into the house. There was some guy sitting in the room and going through the cupboard. He was looking for something. There were traces of blood all over the room. Suddenly, the villain heard someone come into the house. He picked up the knife and walked quietly to the door to watch. Before he could get to the door, he froze with surprise. Yu Sheng got ahead of him and brought the knife to his neck. He ordered him not to move. The blade was a few centimeters away from the aorta. If he pressed down just a little, the guy might die. Yu Sheng added that it pisses him off to wash the floors. The guy who sneaked into the house said he was just looking for medicine and didn't hurt anyone. Yu Sheng prompted that the healing potion was in front on the shelf. To make it clearer, he pointed a finger at that spot. Yu Sheng asked why the guy didn't take the medicine since he was seriously injured. Bloody traces were all over the room. The red-haired guy said it was nothing and he didn't need the medicine. Asked Yu Sheng why he still hasn't lowered his blade. Does he really want to kill him? Yu Sheng replied that it was illegal to kill outside the crime city, and so he would not do it. The red-haired guy exhaled in relief. He said let Yu Sheng think that he owed him his life. The debt would be repaid, and asked the landlord if he needed his help. Yu Sheng thought for a second and said, if he ended up owing him, then will the red-haired guy be able to kill himself? The boy was frightened. He thought that Yu Sheng had short-circuited. It was obvious he didn't want his life after all. So he replied that he was indeed a killer and could kill someone for free, but not himself. Yu Sheng was in no hurry to lower his blade. Said okay and asked that the red-haired guy kill himself. The boy stood in bewilderment. He cried and shouted that he had done nothing to Yu Sheng. Why did he want him dead? Yu Sheng explained the reason. Because he broke into his room, stained his floor. If he were in the crime city right now, he would be dead on his doorstep. The boy was surprised when he heard about the crime city. He didn't believe it. This couldn't be possible. After all, there was an annual quota for one person to be acquitted in a crime city. And since Yu Sheng was too young, it was impossible. Yu Sheng said that the guy is very chatty, and he doesn't like it. The red-haired boy sobbed. Tears streamed down his face. He agreed that he had said some rubbish, and in that case, since he had messed up today, he ordered Yu Sheng to start. The red-haired boy closed his eyes and mentally began to say goodbye to life. He said goodbye to the world, and said that in his next life, he would definitely become the world's best killer. He froze in anticipation, imagining how Yu Sheng would deal with him now. But at that moment, nothing happened. A few more seconds passed, but the guy was still alive. He opened his eye to see what was going on, to see if he was still alive. The red-haired guy looked at Yu Sheng and asked why he wasn't starting. The young man replied that it was against the law to kill outside the crime city, and he can't commit it. Otherwise, the police will figure him out and put him in jail. The guy was taken aback. He asked menacingly if Yu Sheng was bullying him. If he didn't want to kill, he could just let him go and not make a spectacle out of it. But Yu Sheng was not relentless. He was not going to let go of the assassin who had snuck into his house. He had completely different plans for this matter. The red-haired guy wondered why this interlocutor kept talking about illegal activities. He told Yu Sheng that he always repeats the word illegal, but holding someone against their will is also an offense. The implication was that at this point, Yu Sheng was automatically an offender and a criminal. Yu Sheng was familiar with Moge's penal code. After all, he was constantly reading this book and studying the laws. He replied that the penalty for this in the Moge penal code is 3 years in prison. For a serious offense, the penalty is 5 to 8 years imprisonment. Yu Sheng asked how old the red-haired guy was. He replied that he was 17. He was a little younger than Yu Sheng. Yu Sheng thought for a moment. This guy was only 17 years old. He hadn't even awakened yet. The young man pulled the blade away from the villain's throat. He slipped the blade into its scabbard under his clothes. The young man replied to the red-haired boy that he could go. The boy could not believe his ears. He asked if it was true that he could walk. Yu Sheng agonized and said goodbye to the guy with a hand gesture. The boy was glad. Finally, he was rid of the weirdo and his life was safe. He started to run away quickly. He had already reached the front door. Yes, that was the door through which he had entered the house. The boy exclaimed joyfully that he was now free. But at that moment, a hand showed itself. It was Yu Sheng's hand. He grabbed the guy by his shirt and squeezed his hand tightly. Yu Sheng pulled the guy back into the house. The red-haired guy wailed. He fell to the floor and asked what he was doing. Yu Sheng calmly replied that the guy had stepped outside the room. Now he was not restricting his freedom, so it was not considered an illegal detention. The guy was very upset. He didn't understand who Yu Sheng was and what he thought he was doing. Yu Sheng said that the red-haired guy was seriously injured, since blood had been running down his clothes all this time and wouldn't stop. He asked him not to move too much. He went to get some medicine. The red-haired guy has to wipe all the blood off the floor. Otherwise... And Shen tossed the guy a Milo and a brush. Yu Sheng walked over to a cabinet and opened it. It was a cabinet with various medicines. He hummed and turned to the guy. The guy dropped to the floor and began to rub the floor diligently. He did it quickly. The bloodstains disappeared from the floor in a flash. Yu Sheng brought the necessary medicine and held it out to the injured man. The boy thanked him. Yu Sheng added that the medicine had expired. The red-haired guy was upset. Yu Sheng looked at him carefully. He had expected exactly this kind of reaction. The guy was annoyed. Yu Sheng was pondering at this moment. Energy was born from negative emotions, but he still needed to summon them. Yu Sheng recalled for a second the convolution that appeared in his mind so often. This time the guy was joking. He just wanted to trigger the wounded guy's negative emotions and analyze. He said it was a joke. The medicine is fit to take. It is not expired. But the wounded guy needs to drink it immediately. Otherwise, he'll die of blood loss within 32 minutes. The wounded guy didn't know that, and he was very surprised. He quickly opened the box and took a few pills. He also took off his t-shirt and began to rewind himself. Sometimes he cried out in pain. The sight of his own blood was terrifying. Yu Sheng watched him closely and said that he didn't look like a killer at all. He asked the guy if he was definitely a killer. The guy replied that he'd only missed once, and asked me to give him some time. His name was Li and Han, and he was 100% sure that he would become the greatest killer in the future. Yu Sheng looked at the guy suspiciously. The wounded guy replied, telling him to forget everything, and he wouldn't understand him anyway. Yu Sheng said that to become an assassin, you have to dedicate yourself to it completely. But is it worth it? The guy had already completely rewrapped himself with bandages. He put on a t-shirt, and he said he wasn't afraid to die. His dream is to die honorably, like a real killer, because then everyone around him would be proud of him as the most fearless. Yu Sheng asked the guy why he didn't kill him. Then he could have left in peace. The red-haired guy replied that he had his own special professional principles. If he was paid money, he would definitely help. Killing is a job for him, not some kind of entertainment. No one hired him to kill Yu Sheng, so he doesn't touch him. Yu Sheng said the guy is lying. He just can't do it. And he added that it would take a little longer for him to believe that the red-haired guy was a real killer. Yu Sheng added that the kid hadn't awakened into a killer yet. Who would want to hire someone like him? The wounded boy told a little about himself, that he only became an adult half a month ago, and he's about to go through an awakening ceremony. When he received the order, he lied about his age. Otherwise, he wouldn't have got his first order, only he didn't think at all that there's such a big difference between the awakened and the unawakened, even if he could only awaken with a spoon. The spoon in doing so hit his chest and hurt him. That's why there was a wound on his chest, and he lost so much blood. Yu Sheng understood everything. He was going to leave. He told the boy to get better and not to forget to clean the floors. And when he was about to leave, he should pick up the rubbish at the entrance and throw it away. The boy interjected, Yu Sheng is letting him go or not? He repeated that as soon as the guy finished cleaning up, he could leave. Otherwise, he'd owe him his life, and added that if he needed him, he would find him easily. In the meantime, he could live in peace. Yu Sheng leaving remembered something. He added that the awakened are not as strong as he thinks they are. They have a certain gift, but the power comes when they know how to use it properly. That was 100 years ago. The Chi Force has been resurrected. And after that, the wickedness rose up. It ran rampant, endangering the realm of humans. But happily, the first awakened ones appeared, and sacrificing their strength and their lives, they founded 4 great outposts. The Outpost of Taming Evil, the Outpost of Dawn, the Outpost of the Dome, the Outpost of Demons. The 4 outposts stop evil, and human wizards stand guard over them, keeping evil out. Yu Sheng was walking through the city and daydreaming. He heard someone saying that the outpost of pacifying the unclean had failed. Two guys were looking at their phones and chatting loudly. One was talking about how monsters had appeared in Shanghai, and many people had been hurt. On the screen was a picture of a monster that had appeared in Shanghai that had caused people to die. The guys were upset. They didn't understand how this could have happened, what the Ministry of Exorcism was doing then. How could they let this happen? The young man added that it's not getting peaceful on the ground, and it's good that they haven't had anything like that happen here yet. Yu Sheng slowly moved away from the guys. He kept his way towards the stall, and here he finally reached it. The stall sold lots of goodies. The boy went into a stall. A salesman was sitting behind the counter. He was wearing a t-shirt and yawning. Everything indicated that the seller had just woken up. Or he was asleep at his workplace and the guy had woken him up. He looked intently into the young man's eyes, said the goods were there, and pointed to a sealed bag that was on the table. The guy wasn't thrilled about the deal. He said it was the last time he would come for the goods. The seller said they're even now. Yu Sheng turned around and started to walk away, and told the salesman that they would definitely see each other again. The salesman smiled wryly. He reckoned it wouldn't be soon. The salesman stepped away from the counter and repeated that they would never meet again. Yu Sheng came to his house. He sat down on the bench in the kitchen and opened the envelope. From the envelope, he took out a bright red crystal. He began to scrutinize it carefully. It was the demonic crystal quintessence that the undead create after absorbing human life forces. He picked up the crossbow. In his room, he had set up several stands. On the stands, he had a crossbow each, which were pointed in different directions in his room. He tied a rope to each crossbow. He tied one end of the rope to the front door handle. This mechanism would set off a chain reaction and cause the crossbows to line up the moment someone opened the door. He gathered all the ropes in his hand. It would allow him to trigger the crossbow's trigger mechanism from a distance. He squatted down and thought about it. Suddenly, something began to happen to the crystal. A bright red light began to emanate from it. The outpost for the pacification of the unclean looked like a high cliff. The approach to it was shrouded in barbed wire. There were people in the outpost. They always walked around in hooded cloaks. People were coming down from the outpost. Suddenly, the young man saw that the road was closed. This was also told to him by an elder who was sitting cross-legged and meditating. The boy fell on his knees before the elder and begged him to open the way. They had to go through. The elder looked at him carefully, and once again he sternly repeated that the road was closed. The young man was restless and insisted that the elder open the road. Some unknown force began to fly over the outpost of subduing the uncleanness. A staff rose above the elder. The elder shouted out, "Death!" A black funnel formed above the men. The guys were terrified. The young man told the elder that he was just joking. His divine guidance had served the human race for a long time, sacrificing everything in the process. They would not dare to challenge the elder. The young men turned around and walked back to where they came from. As soon as the boys turned their backs to the elder, there was a question. The elder asked the young man if he wanted to pass. The guy got excited and asked if he had any more advice. The elder repeated that when they returned, they would have to tell their divine throne to change his name. And he added, if he had not had to defend this place where it was not proper to raise a hand, the young men would be dead by now. The young man laughed, thanked him for the advice, and promised the elder that he would be sure to pass it on. The young men went further down the road. The elder escorted them carefully with his gaze. The staff rose above him once more, and the energy swirled. A week later, Yu Sheng was sitting in his room furnished with crossbows. In front of him, a red-colored crystal was floating in front of him. 2 gray-colored crystals were lying on the floor. Yu Sheng's phone rang, but the guy didn't respond. Suddenly, the crystal that was previously floating in the air clad in red color fell to the floor. It changed its color from red to gray. The young man opened his eyes. He immediately picked up the phone and answered the call. The call was from his class teacher, Liu Qingfeng. He asked that the young man return to school tomorrow morning. A man from the Ministry of Exorcism is coming. He will be evaluating the trained students. The best will be allocated resources. This assessment is very important. Only 1 student will pass. The teacher said that it didn't matter if Yu Sheng was the one who could pass, but asked him to try his best. The young man agreed to try. The class teacher asked the pupil why he could not reach his father. The pupil replied that most likely the prison where his father was currently incarcerated did not allow mobile phones. The teacher remembered that the young man's father was in prison. He's pretty much forgotten. This is the guy who ratted out his father himself for dating prostitutes, which is why he's behind bars now. Yu Sheng walked over and looked carefully at the calendar. 312 days left, he thought. The next day, young man came to school. He was sitting in the classroom deep in thought. He propped his head with his hand. Perhaps in this position he could think better. His classmates were discussing something animatedly. They were worried about who exactly would be chosen. Who would be the lucky one? Everyone wanted to be the best and fight the monsters. One boy said that if he wasn't chosen, he would fly away. Their class teacher walked into the classroom, and the students fell silent. The teacher pronounced that a notification had just come in and everything had changed. He continued his speech. This time, not only from the Ministry of Exorcism, but also the officers in the reserve of the Ministry of Security came from Shenli. Also, the grading format has changed. Each school will put up 5 eligible students, after which they will be screened. In the end, the best one will remain. The students began to mentally ask to be chosen. Even if they were selected later, everyone wanted to shine their faces among the lucky ones. The teacher raised his hand and said, "That from their class. The principal has decided to choose." It sounded like a verdict. All the students held their breath waiting. The teacher said Yu Sheng's name. There were some indignant remarks. The guy was indignant. He asked why Yu Sheng was chosen all of a sudden. Someone confirmed that he was a weakling. The students started shouting out Heimu's name. In most people's opinion, he was the perfect candidate. A commotion started in the classroom. The teacher asked for silence. He asked the students, did they disagree? Was the choice not made fairly? He asked the students to remember that there is no justice in this life. If at any time you are treated unfairly, you have to endure and improve yourself until you break the injustice. And here it is useless to shout. You just need to work on yourself and then everything will work out. The students sat at their desks with their eyes downcast. They were upset. The teacher asked Yu Sheng to go to the principal's office, who wanted to meet with the young man. Yu Sheng agreed. The young man stood in front of the headmaster. The man gave the student a glance. He was surprised that the student was so cheerful. He asked if his father was all right. The young man replied that machinations in the criminal city were expensive. The class teacher looked at the boy questioningly. The principal also didn't understand what the young man wanted to say with these words. The teacher coughed and said it was time to get to the point. This assessment tests not only the student, but also the school they attend. Mobei is a small town. 3 schools are not very well known. That's why the administration is planning to merge. Who will be the principal of the new school most likely depends on this certification. If done wisely, everyone would be the beneficiary. He asked Yu Sheng, no matter what happens, not to give in. The young man asked what the price would be. The principal asked back in surprise, as if he hadn't heard his question. The young man said that according to the rules of the crime city, if someone asks a man for something, he must pay him in return. That's the right thing to do. Yu Sheng emphasized that he would not take this case for free. The teacher looked at his student in surprise. The guy wasn't as simple as he seemed at first glance. The principal said that the young man will get into the exam. And it's not only the principal who benefits, but also Yu Sheng. The guy replied that, if he understood correctly, the principal needed him to look into it. And the exam is just a ticket that someone has to fund. It would be a kind of fee for a favor performed. In a crime-ridden city, people who don't follow the rules die quickly. It was obvious that the director was angry. He was thinking about what kind of criminal city this was. The principal was willing to give him 3 level 1 crystals. The lad replied that he was willing to make that arrangement. He was about to leave, but he asked another question. Would it be necessary to kill someone in the process? The director was shocked, and so was his assistant. He blurted out worriedly that no one needed to be killed. The young man said, good, for it was forbidden to kill outside the crime city, and added that there were 3 soul stones missing. The principal asked the young man to rest on the school bus. He also said that other students should not bother him. He just needs to forget about them and not worry about it. And also to remember not to kill anyone. The boy agreed and went out. He was sitting on the school bus. Suddenly, a guy said hello to him. His name was Zhao Zicheng. He was from 9B. Zhao introduced his friends the girl Li Kai and the young man Yang Zhouxin. He asked the young man what his name was. The young man replied that his name was Yu Sheng. The guy told Yu Sheng that this year's grading would secretly be Mayor Moge. Their mobe was very small, and Mogue didn't have much strength, so Premier Sun is also an elder of Mogai, and he believes that the best talents come out of there. In the past, Master Protectors also came out of Mobe. They gave resources, then raised the next generation. The Masters would leave, and the newcomers would become Defenders. If you join Moge, you'll be famous, and whoever is chosen, everyone will be watching the exam. It follows that this is a unique opportunity to become successful. Zhao said that other schools also had many masters. He assumed that they would usually choose one candidate, and the other 3 would be chosen to help. That way, the chosen one would have a better chance. It wouldn't be easy to win. A girl laughed from behind and said that without exception, Headman Zhao would definitely win. Headman Zhao's father is the head of the Mobe security department. The guy sitting next to him added that Headman Zhao was chosen for certification. He added that one word from him and he can count on their support. Zhao was encouraged. He replied, if that was the case, then willy-nilly he would have to get this victory. Zhao told Yu Sheng to relax. After all, he would have brilliant prospects with him. Yu Sheng asked if it was true that his father was the head of the security department. Zhao replied that yes, the very real one. Yu Sheng told the boy in confidence that his father was currently in prison. Zhao replied that it wasn't a matter of if he hadn't violated anything serious, he could put in a word with his father and Yu Sheng's father would be released. Yu Sheng negatively waved his head. That wasn't what he meant at all. He asked Zhao for the opposite. Yu Sheng wanted his father's sentence increased. Zhao was confused. He didn't expect Yu Sheng to ask such a thing. Zhao thought about how much you had to hate your own father to imprison him on purpose. And to want to increase his sentence on purpose, it was despicable. Zhao, immersed in thought, looked out the window. Yu Sheng was stunned. He didn't understand why the gray energy wasn't exuding this time. Had he done something wrong and incorrect? The bus was traveling out of town. Yu Sheng stared thoughtfully out the window. Zhao jumped up and asked that they were leaving the city and added that the certification would not be held in the city. Zhao turned to the driver. Perhaps the driver had taken the wrong route and gone to the wrong place. After all, there had been an incident in Xinhai recently, and it wasn't safe at all outside the city now. The driver replied that there was no error. We changed the place for a while. There is an old factory not far from the city. That's where the certification will take place, and the bus is heading there. The driver went on to say that it was more comfortable outside the city, because there was plenty of space. He also said that there was nothing to worry about, because they had Moga people with them, so there was no danger. Zhao agreed and asked the driver to shout when they arrived at the place. After all, the students wanted to take a nap. The driver agreed. Yu Sheng didn't feel like sleeping at all. His mind was spinning with thoughts. The driver shouted that they had arrived. Several school buses were already parked in front of the old factory building. The students were leaving the bus. Zhao exclaimed that they had finally arrived. Everything was as it said. Zhao saw one guy he knew. He was surprised that he had come here as well. Zhao said that Dushu had also arrived. It was that 6-pattern talent. The guys began to discuss Dushu animatedly. What kind of beard he had, how he was able to grow such a thicket, and many other questions. Yu Sheng stepped a little aside from the guys. Zhao turned to Yu Sheng and said that even though they had not agreed beforehand, he hoped that the young man would shun this Dushu as he was very strong. Yu Sheng agreed. Zhao hoped that Yu Sheng wouldn't lose, and called him second. The disciples walked towards the door. In the distance, a warrior was smoking and watching the students closely. He threw the cigarette butt on the floor and put it out with his foot. The driver went the other way. He walked into a room with CCTV cameras where a man was sitting. The young man asked how things were going. The driver replied that things were not going well. The driver sat down in his chair and began to narrate. That students have low vigilance, trust strangers easily, think naively. A deaf city with self-government is just a dream. The driver hesitated at this point. He pointed his finger at one of the monitors, where Yu Sheng was just passing by at that moment. He added that this was the guy who should be interested. The students had already lined up in a line. The supervisor came out in front of him and began the story. That this time, he would be in charge of the assessment. The topics of the assessment are not yet known. It is necessary to wait for the people from the Ministry of Exorcism, then everything will become clearer. The supervisor reiterated that this is a unique opportunity, and for the students to get their heads round it. It's always necessary to be cautious, to act only with a clear head. If they follow his advice, Only then will they have a chance of success. The leader looked at Yusheng and thought, this time, he doesn't know if this kid can surprise him. Suddenly, the gate behind the students opened. Everyone looked round in surprise. An SUV speeding into the gate. He noisily parked close to the students. A foot shod in gray trainers appeared from the car. A man came out. He was tall, slender, and his hair was styled in a stylish style. He had black glasses over his eyes and a cigarette in his teeth. He walked past the students and walked over to the leader. The man put his arm round his shoulders. He called the leader Old Man Liu. As it turned out, they were old acquaintances, but had not seen each other for many years. The man asked how the leader came to be here. The supervisor responded that he works as a teacher and is here with his students because there will be a certification today. The man was surprised. He looked at the teacher over his glasses. He could not believe that his old acquaintance was now a teacher. The man furrowed an eyebrow, and then he said it wasn't bad. At least it's not as dangerous as theirs. He looked round at the students carefully, and with a smile he clarified, "These girls and boys are his students." The students were whispering amongst themselves at this moment. They didn't understand if this man was from the ministry or Moog. He seemed creepy. Man, he was looking right at them, and some of the students' legs were getting woozy. The man looked at each of their students carefully. He approached Yusheng and asked if he was afraid of him. The young man replied why it was he who should be afraid of him. The man laughed. He patted the young man's shoulder and said that it wasn't bad, and told Old Man Liu that this guy was interesting. The man turned to the students. He introduced himself to the guys. His name was Luo Tian, and he was from the Janbei Province Ministry of Exorcism. He was the captain of the 3rd Squad, the 5th generation of awakened ones. He said that this was enough to know, and that he would not talk about the rest of his achievements, because there was nothing interesting there, so there was nothing to brag about. And as for today's certification, he was silent for a moment. He had to think. He took a drag on his cigarette. He couldn't think of a better way. The students looked questioningly at the man. Some thought was born in his mind, and he laughed. He said the boys should win the fight. Whoever wins, stays. Whoever loses would leave. One of the girls exclaimed that this is what grading is all about. The teacher looked at the acquaintance in surprise and thought that this man hadn't changed at all. The man said it was time to begin, and some unknown force rose above him in the form of the wolf. The unknown force began to move faster. It began to circle, and a circle of light formed. The man said that this circle would be a kind of ring. If a student gave up or went outside the circle, it would be considered a defeat and he would be eliminated. He quickly picked out 2 guys. He pointed his finger at them and ordered them to fight. One of the young men stepped closer to the ring. He folded his arms on his chest and introduced himself. He is the first. His name is Xiaozi Feng, and he asked to be instructed. The contestants ran to the center of the circle. They entered the ring and began to fight. One of the guys jumped up and prepared for a punch. The other guy also yelled and rushed towards him. The fight began. Everything was happening so fast that it was like a cloud of dust with arms and legs showing. The leader and the man in black watched the battle. Not a single bit of martial power could be seen. But that was okay. The students weren't from some big city after all. They had never been taught martial arts. The fight had stopped. One young man was lying on his back. The winner was Zifeng. He asked the people around him not to laugh at his performance. The man was amused by these words, and he added that Zifeng had won. The man showed the next 2 guys who were to fight next. One of them was Yusheng, the other Dushu. The opponent turned to the young man and said confidently that he would beat him. The class teacher looked at his student. He really hoped he would surprise him. The young men entered the ring. Yusheng raised his hand and asked, "Is it possible to use weapons during battle?" The man said naturally, "He can use any weapon he wants." The students began to discuss. This guy is definitely an idiot to ask such a thing. If he is allowed to use a weapon, then his opponent is allowed to use it too. The guys were saying that Dushu would make Yusheng an invalid. Suddenly Zhao shouted out. He asked Yusheng not to let them down. It could be seen that this guy was worried about Yusheng. The man exhaled cigarette smoke and said it was time to start. Yusheng squatted down. With one hand resting on the floor, the other was pulled back from him. He pushed his foot off the floor, and with speed headed for his opponent, who at that moment was holding a stick. Yusheng ran up to his opponent with lightning speed. Blood showed on his opponent's hand. It was the hand that held the stick that was wounded. The stick fell out and hit the floor. Du Shu cried out in pain. He was holding onto his hand, which was bleeding scarlet blood. Yu Sheng was holding a metal sharp object in his hand at this moment. Du Shu fell to his knees and yelled hysterically in pain. Yu Sheng walked towards him. A knife could already be seen behind his back. He put his hand on his face and pushed him. Du Shu fell on his back. Yu Sheng raised his knife. Du Shu thought that the young man wanted to kill him. He started shouting that it was only a competition and begged him not to kill him. Yu Sheng held his knife above his opponent. He swung and stuck his knife next to his opponent's head. Du Shu was terrified. His entire life flew before his eyes in an instant. When the opponent realized that he was alive and the young man was just joking, he shouted that Yu Sheng was bullying him. At that moment, a man approached the guys. Oh laughed loudly. Yu Sheng grabbed his opponent and forcefully opened his mouth. He reached into his mouth with his fingers. The man with glasses was surprised. He asked what he wanted to do, and he pulled out a tooth from Du Shu's mouth. He looked at his tooth and asked why there was no poison. He is probably hiding it somewhere else. The young man started going through his hair. He was obviously looking for something. The man scratched the back of his head in surprise and asked, "Was he looking for poison by any chance?" Yu Sheng said that he was looking for it, but it's all kind of weird. He can't find where the enemy is hiding the poison. The man asked a question, "Is there any chance that he is not hiding it?" And he put his index finger up. Yu Sheng looked at the man carefully. He said that this could not be the case. If he was captured by the enemy and he didn't have poison, he wouldn't be able to kill himself. His torment would be worse than death. Du Shu had streams of tears running down his cheeks. Du Shu hesitated for a moment. It was true. Why didn't he hide the poison? Then he could have killed himself at any time. Then he exclaimed that he had no reason to hide the poison. He has a wonderful life now. What kind of a thought to kill himself? A man came up behind Yu Sheng. He realized that the boy was most likely from a crime city, so he asked the young man about it. The guy confirmed that he was indeed from a crime city, and he was surprised that people outside the crime city didn't hide poison. He just couldn't believe it. A man asked the class teacher if he knew about it. The class teacher asked what this had to do with his pupil. The class teacher said that according to the rules, it doesn't matter if he has committed heinous crimes in the past. After leaving the crime city, it's out of the question. The class teacher stepped closer to the man in black and reiterated that it's only off the table if he hasn't killed someone else. Otherwise, all he needs is one day without mistakes, and he is forever his disciple. Yu Sheng stood behind the teacher. The man scratched his head and said it would be better to forget this conversation. After all, his enemies were foul things, not people. He added that today was the end of it. The man turned round and said that the assessment would continue tomorrow. The factory is big, and there is enough room for everyone to sleep there. He pointed towards one of the rooms and asked to sleep there. The man walked to his car and asked the class teacher that it had been so long since they had seen each other that it was a good excuse to have a drink. The teacher said that was unlikely, as his students were still here. A man getting into the car told the teacher that his student was from the Forbidden City, and he added that it was difficult for him to predict whether he would pass his certification. A rat rustled in the corner. The students walked into the room. They were upset. It was filthy all around. It was impossible to sit on the floor, let alone sleep for the whole night. They were outraged that they had to stay here overnight. Everything indicated that not only cockroaches, but also huge rats lived here. But what to do, the students didn't know what to do. One young man began to say that he did not want to spend the night here under any condition. One of the students approached the teacher. He said that there was one thing he did not understand. The teacher was sitting on the floor ready to listen to him. The young man said, "Why is it that the higher the talent, the not higher the level in the future? Or is he wrong?" The young man asked why that man from the ministry didn't look at the talents of the others. The teacher said that talent alone cannot lead to the top. Someone exclaimed that there are geniuses everywhere. With such a large population, the emergence of geniuses is commonplace. The teacher said that if only talent was needed, people would have suppressed the foulness long ago. The teacher said that he had seen many geniuses in his life, but only a few of them had risen to the top. The young man thought, and the teacher went on to say that to consider one's talent an extraordinary gift, and oneself superior to everyone else, was tantamount to arrogance. He had seen how people were wrong about the simplest things. The lucky ones who studied at the famous schools joined the outposts to subdue the unclean. and at the sight of uncleanness, they trembled with fear, killed none, and were eventually beheaded. The teacher saw it with his own eyes. What this world lacks more than anything else are geniuses. Take anyone in Moga, they're all stronger than you, but at what cost to them? The students listened thoughtfully to the teacher's speech. The master also said that the disciples did not pass through the 4 great outposts, for there human life means nothing, cheaper than a sip of water or a piece of bread. Whether a man can survive is not talent, it's character, it's luck. Without determination and a cool head, without sufficient discretion, one could be nothing more than a mockery. The students were silent. They pondered the teacher's words. The teacher said that it was necessary to rest now. After all, tomorrow the assessment would continue. One young man replied that he was not so tired, but the surroundings were so dirty that he would not be able to sleep in such conditions. The teacher asked the young man sternly, "Does he feel squeamish? He doesn't want to sleep among severed limbs. There are more important situations, when you don't know whether you'll wake up tomorrow or not." And the teacher menacingly urged everyone to sit down. He also reiterated that compared to the 4 outposts, this was still a flower. He called out to look at Yu Sheng. The young man simply sat down on the floor. He considered himself no better than anyone in this room. Did he look like he was arrogant? Yu Sheng watched silently. He didn't like being made an example of. At this moment, he was the center of attention. Everyone was looking at the guy with wide eyes. Yu Sheng leaned on his knee and started to rise. Zhao asked where he was going. The young man replied that he was going to the toilet. When the young man stepped back, Zhao said that although Yu Sheng was gloomy, he was a good guy. The girl didn't seem to agree. She asked him what he was showing. Zhao sighed fatally. Yu Sheng walked carefully. He pressed himself against the walls to avoid being caught in a cell. There were cameras everywhere. He slowly made his way round, skimming the cells. When he saw another cell, he decided it was most likely the last one. He didn't know if there was anything else in the factory. He analyzed the situation. The whole factory was covered with cameras. But the boy knew that there must be some place where there were no cameras. He decided that he should check all the rooms and find a place where there were no cameras. He quickly ran to the factory premises. Yu Sheng prowled around and looked into every room, reached out for the handle. He opened the door slightly and heard someone talking. The conversation was about Liu Qingfeng. Someone asked if there was any information about the teacher. The person said that there wasn't. There were men in the room. One of the men said that if one recalled the conversation between the teacher and the man from the ministry, one could conclude that he too had been on an outpost of pacifying the unclean. The man added that Liu Qingfeng was a good teacher, but he was wasting his talent here. Another voice said that the teacher would like to be offered a transfer to the regional center. After all, his teaching methods deserve attention. Yu Sheng listened attentively to their conversation. He knew it was not good to eavesdrop, but if it would help him find out useful information, then sometimes he could. Yu Sheng looked into the room. There were 2 men standing there, and sitting there was the driver of the bus that was taking the students to the factory. The room that didn't have a single camera was a monitor room. Yu Sheng walked back. The students were almost all asleep. The teacher sat in the corner with his hand on his head and dozed off. The young man tried to pass so as not to wake the teacher, but the teacher was awake. He asked the young man a question. Had he prepared his lone wolf plan? The young man crouched in a corner and thought. It was night. Yu Sheng looked carefully and listened carefully. He heard some noise. The teacher looked at him menacingly. The young man held a crossbow in his hand. The teacher saw the crossbow in his hand, but he said it was none of his business. Yu Sheng headed for the exit. The teacher looked at him and thought that it was the loners who were the most likely to suffer a tragic end. There was a man from the ministry standing outside who came to visit the students in the afternoon in an SUV. He had a huge dog on a chain. As he approached the room where the disciples were staying, he laughed, and he said that it was time for them to find out what the awakened ones who dared to sleep in the open air were really facing. At that point, the man let go of the leash. The beast opened its jaws wide and lunged forward. It was not a dog at all, but a monster. Outwardly, it had some resemblance to a huge dog. The monster's eyes were burning with red light. There were patterns on its body. The men who were in the monitor room saw a furious monster on the screen. They were horrified and didn't understand why this demon had appeared here. They shouted Luo Yun's name and called him an idiot. They surmised that it was his handiwork. They couldn't believe their eyes. Did he really want the disciples to try and kill the demon? But they were so young and inexperienced. They hadn't even finished school yet. The men ran up to the bus driver, who was dozing peacefully on the sofa, and started waking him up. They called him Captain. He was probably in charge of them. The captain woke up and looked out from under his cap, and said there was no need to panic. The men could calm down and sit back in their seats. How much trouble one demon could bring. But on second thought, it's a good thing. I mean, the school raised a bunch of nerds. Maybe they learned something during their time at school, and decided that it would be good for these students to see the blood. The man sitting behind the monitor shrieked. Before doing such a thing, the captain should have thought of the consequences. After all, playing with life is no joke. The captain pulled back the canopy of his jacket. He showed the patch on his sleeve. It had a picture of a demonic creature on it. He said it was the thing that would decide if there was trouble or not. The man calmed down a little and agreed. The captain at this point lit a cigarette. He added that a little activity was not a bad thing. He wanted to see what the students were worth. The monster was aggressive. It growled at the whole neighborhood and ran quickly through the corridors looking for people. A second more, and he flew into the room where the students were. The students had heard the danger coming. They had already woken up and started to scatter in different directions at the appearance of the monster. The students couldn't understand how a demon could be here. The monster went towards one of the students. The boy was frightened and started calling for help. The monster grinned. His mouth was full of sharp teeth. Suddenly, Du Shu stood up for the guy. He stood in front of him and asked him not to be afraid, saying that he would protect him. The guy was holding a stick in front of him. The monster howled and prepared to jump. Another second, and it rushed towards Du Shu. The guy yelped, and blood flew to the side. Suddenly, someone's foot kicked the monster in the head. It was Zhao. He said not to be afraid, and covered Du Shu, who was wounded, and suggested that they join forces so that the demon couldn't hurt them. Panic broke out among the students. They called for help from the teacher. They shouted that they were scared and wanted to go home. The teacher stood calmly against the wall and watched what was happening. He did not rush to help. He didn't know if such an ordeal would really be beneficial to the students. At this time, the young men were being watched by the captain through the camera. He said those two guys were brave, but a little dumb. They didn't know that a hellhound's head was the strongest part. But it wasn't bad for them to be stubborn. Suddenly, the captain remembered Yu Sheng's disciple. Because he was annoying him, he wasn't in that room. The captain went to the door and grasped the handle to open it. He looked out and said there was no need to look for him. Outside the door, he saw Yu Sheng standing there. The captain asked if he had come to sit. Yu Sheng was asked how he got here. The boy calmly replied that he was following a trail. It wasn't quite clear how he did it. After all, it was simply impossible to get here on unclear tracks. The man knew that the boy was from the criminal city, but he didn't think he would be so strange. Yu Sheng sat down on the sofa. The men asked why he didn't go to help his classmates. Does he really want them all to die? The young man said he was not going to help because they would not die. The captain shouted that he would not help the disciples, and if Yu Sheng himself didn't do it, they would fail and die. The young man said that the hellhound just seems strong. It's actually weak. So even if the young man doesn't help them, they still won't die. The captain was already yelling. He asked what would happen to the disciples if the hound's strength increased. Yu Sheng replied that they won't increase, and he knows that for a fact. The captain threatened that he would strengthen it on purpose. What will he do then? The youth replied that the captain would then indirectly kill the students, or even premeditatedly. The youth added that according to Article 75 of the Moga Penal Code, this is punishable by imprisonment of 7 years or more, or face the death penalty. The captain agreed, and asked if he went to deal with the disciples now. Would Yu Sheng be able to save them? The men saw that the captain was getting nervous. Yu Sheng stood up and negatively nodded his head. He said that he wouldn't save the disciples anyway. The captain yelled that the students were his classmates. Does the young man really want to see them die? It flashed through his mind how this guy could be so selfish. The young man replied that he couldn't handle the captain. How could he save them then? The only option left would be to die with them. Yu Sheng suggested another option. He could report the matter to the police and then receive the benefit. The guy kept talking. According to Moga's new school policy, if a student dies during a mission, there's a payout of 30 or 50,000. And if you witness and report the murderer, You can also get a good reward. Yu Sheng was smart. He knew the entire criminal code of Moge. If there is a murder of 10 students, the murderer will be issued an arrest warrant as a particularly dangerous criminal. He can get a 10, and asked the captain if he would kill the students. The captain was stunned. He didn't know what to say. At this time, some stranger with 2 men was standing on a rock. It was at God's place. They were bathed in starlight. God was watching them at that moment. If the plan succeeds this time, then perhaps all 3 will have a chance to be exalted and become servants of God. That is the greatest of all graces. He pronounced that this night, these cleverest students were destined to die. The men behind him also picked up the cry. They shouted that the disciples were destined to die. The man said, "Let their lives be their payment," and asked them to atone for their sins. You should have waited half an hour and then started. At this time in Baichunchen, in Moga Division, a man was sitting in the office of the division chief. He was writing something. The man was the head of the unit. Suddenly his mobile phone rang. He picked up the phone and answered that it was the supervisor. The phone was talking about some kind of deal. The supervisor was interested in this and asked to speak further. Actually, the offer was nothing. There was one favor to be done. In 10 minutes, a motorcade was to pass from the north without the guards disturbing it. The heresy of 1,000 gods. The supervisor asked for a price. The voice from the phone said that Chief Lin had organized student evaluations for schools from distant cities, including the city of Mobe, where the grading had not yet ended. There were only 12 students there. Was it possible that it was? The head of the unit said that a deal always has a guarantor, and if the person who spoke into the phone continued to be coy, he would have no choice. The voice on the phone said it was a bargain, and he is a preserve. The warden has no bargaining rights. Of course, if Moog is full of hypocrisy and lets the poor kids die, then there is nothing to object to. The warden agreed. He warned that if anyone died in Mobi, he was already holding the phone in his hands. The chief said that in 6 months' time, everyone in Jiangbei province would rise up again and destroy their sect. He promised it. From the phone came a statement, the heresy of 1,000 gods. Meanwhile, in the monitor room, the captain was stunned. He had lost a large amount of money. They were paying 30,000 each. He had lost as much as 300,000. Yu Sheng asked the captain if he could copy this tape to him. The captain didn't understand what the guy wanted to do, and he asked him about it. Yu Sheng replied that there are unknown answers during the certification. If you mistakenly think that someone is really in danger and save them, you can get a reward. 12 people, totaling 360,000. The captain yelled nervously. He called the young man insolent. It wasn't fair to the other students. The captain said he would definitely report the young man to Mogi and have him expelled as soon as possible. He's a big parasite. The men behind the captain gave an enthusiastic thumbs up and said that it was not for nothing that everyone praised the captain, and they paid their respects to him. Yu Sheng turned around and said that he would give half of it back. The captain was greatly surprised. The captain was pleased. He said it was a good cooperation and he would sort it out. Meanwhile, the disciples continued to confront the monster. Zhao asked if Du Shu was still holding on. The guy replied that he was fine. He thought about how Yu Sheng anticipated everything and always carried a knife with him. If only one of them had a weapon, they would definitely be able to deal with the monster. No one knew where Yu Sheng had gone. Zhao said that if he came back now, he would call him father. At that moment, footsteps sounded. The guys were surprised. As soon as they spoke about it, Yu Sheng entered the room. He stood behind the monster. Zhao had to keep his promise and call him dad. Yu Sheng said that it didn't suit him very well. Zhao asked where the young man had been. Yu Sheng replied that he was in the toilet. Zhao accused the young man of lying. He was sure that it was impossible not to hear those sounds. Yu Sheng apologized. He was always bad at lying. The boys were outraged. Yu Sheng calmly walked around the monster and headed towards the disciples. Du Shu wondered if he had just passed through so easily, and didn't even glance at the hellhound. And he added that he didn't know why, but they needed to all be together. It would be safer for everyone. Yu Sheng hesitated for a moment. The young man asked if he could hurt them. The guys didn't know what he meant. Suddenly, Zhao grabbed his heart and fell to his knees. He groaned. He was in a lot of pain. The boys looked at their classmate. In the same second, Du Shu fell to the floor and started wriggling in pain. He was also yipping and shouting that he was in a lot of pain. At that, the young man held his back. Yu Sheng looked up. He uttered, "It turns out that there is such a ferocious demon here treading on his comrades. They are the youth of Moge, fighting for the humans, swearing their lives to protect. The young man did not have time to finish. The monster threw itself right at Yu Sheng. The men watched the young man and the monster through the monitor. The cameras not only broadcast video, they also transmitted sound. Therefore, what was going on in the room was being listened to by the men in the monitor room. Yu Sheng spoke well. If Moge heard it, he would definitely be moved and send money. If you think about it rationally, it's no big deal. They looked at the monitor. The captain said he'd been wrong to put the hound under this kid's control, and that he had given him more room to maneuver. Further, Yu Sheng was unlikely to cooperate with the captain. One of the men who stood near the captain looked surprised and pointed at the monitor. He asked the captain to look at the screen, and he jabbed his finger at the screen. At this moment, Yu Sheng shouted out that it was his sacred duty to protect his comrade, and that people's torch would not be extinguished. With one blow, he knocked out the hound. The dog fell on its back. It was dead. The captain's eyes bulged with surprise. He had been watching this game. Yu Sheng said that it turns out that this is where his comrades were attacked by such a ferocious demon, and if he hadn't come in time... Zhao continued to writhing in pain. The captain was terribly upset. He called Yu Sheng an arsehole. He said he was obviously overplaying his hand and no one would believe him. He also shouted for the young man not to deprive the captain of his freebies. Yu Sheng turned his attention to the cameras that hung above the window. All the students gathered around the breathless dog. Zhao asked, wondering if this was the end. The thought flashed through the students' minds that they were all students here. Why then is there such a gap between them? So they are really useless. Zhao and Du Shu fought desperately, and it was Yu Sheng who defeated the monster. Suddenly the door to the room opened. A man stood on the threshold. He stood with his back to the moonlight. It was hard to make out who he was. The man exclaimed that the gods were all with him. The disciples looked at the stranger in surprise. The stranger shouted that he was giving new souls to the gods. He raised his hands up and a bowl of some kind appeared above him. Zhao asked in surprise if this was a level 1 awakened person. Someone said it might be the heretic, but where would he come from? The man stood with his hand up, the bowl continuing to swirl above him. Zhao said that heretics kill mercilessly. Zhao continued, the first level awakened one is slightly stronger than a hellhound, and right now their only hope. And all the disciples looked at Yu Sheng as if in conspiracy. Zhao grabbed his head, he said. His wound still hurts a lot. And he added that they were smart, so they should act smarter. Yu Sheng exclaimed that it was forbidden by law to kill people. The man shouted out the first one and ran towards the students. He wanted to cover Yu Sheng with the bowl, but the young man jumped up and the bowl fell to the floor. The stranger said that the young man had good skills, and the gods would like that. It was heretic. He thought for a moment that the young man had simply disappeared. Yu Sheng had already pointed his crossbow at the man, but then he remembered the prohibition against killing, and he immediately lowered his crossbow. The stranger turned his attention away from Yu Sheng and ran up to the other disciples. He said that he would kill them first. The stranger raised the cup and said that the gods were with him and their radiance was eternal. At that moment, the young man jumped on the stranger from behind. He wanted to hit him with a sharpened piece of metal, but stopped himself. It would be wrong, for the young man could not kill. And he slashed the stranger's arm. Blood spurted from his hand. The man repeated that the gods were with him and their radiance was eternal. He forcefully threw Yu Sheng away from him. The boy flew into the distance. Yu Sheng kept his eyes on the stranger, and he was already very close and tried so hard to bowl the kid over. With a cry of die, the stranger started to catch Yu Sheng with the bowl. The guy was pulling away, twisting, doing somersaults. He was trying to get away from the bowl in every way he could. The man watched into the monitor. He said the heresy had somehow returned. So he turned to Liu Yun. The man said that there was an incident during the appraisal and a heretic appeared. It had to be dealt with immediately. The captain was horrified when he saw heretic on the monitor screen. The heretic headed towards Yu Sheng again. The young man heard the voice of his class teacher. The teacher shouted that killing heretic was authorized. The teacher watched the contest closely. This boy was inimitable. The teacher once again shouted loudly that killing the heretic was not forbidden by law. On the contrary, whoever succeeds in killing him will receive a reward of 100,000. Yu Sheng heard the teacher and held the sharpened iron in his hand. He threw himself at heretic, grabbed heretic's hand and held it, preventing her from lowering the cup. With his other hand, in which he held a sharpened piece of iron, he swung, and in a swift movement he slashed his throat. The heretic fell to the floor in the same second. The students screamed that he killed him, and that the grading was weird. Everyone thought Yu Sheng was very cruel. The young man asked what the law the teacher had told him about, why he had not seen it before. The teacher repeated that only those who are truly awakened will be able to understand the rules. Du Xiong exclaimed in surprise that Yu Sheng had now taken a man's life. The teacher understood. The students were horrified because it was the first time they had seen a dead person. Everyone thought Yu Sheng was very cruel. But why did they themselves volunteer to be awakened and dare to kill? The teacher continued that if Yu Sheng hadn't killed the heretic, everyone in the room would have died. The teacher said that he would have loved to see each disciple at the moment when they would one day disappoint everyone. The teacher spoke next. He invited the students standing near the corpse to look at it carefully, to look at his wounds and also into his eyes. They were to face the fear that would help each of them to win. Zhao said he wasn't afraid at all. His father is the head of the security department. Du Xiong said that if Zhao wasn't afraid, then he wasn't afraid either. A few students stood there and couldn't say they weren't afraid. They were scared, very scared. The teacher said that the best outcome for them would be to stay ordinary people. And he said that tomorrow they would go back to school and live their lives as they had before. The teacher turned his head towards Yu Sheng and asked him to follow him. They went outside. They walked slowly and talked. The teacher asked if the boy had killed before. It was obvious that he had experience. The boy said he had. The teacher asked another question when he did it for the first time. Yu Sheng replied that it was around the age of 5 or 6. The teacher looked at the boy and called him a boy. The young man thought for a second and said, "It's not illegal to kill in a crime-ridden city. It's the order of the day." The teacher replied that among all the students he had met, Yu Sheng was the best. With his talents, the young man could become invincible. The teacher lit a cigarette and spoke to the young man. He did not want to comment on his future, but as a teacher he hoped he had a good heart. He asked his disciple not to point his weapon at people no matter what. Yu Sheng said he would try, but there was one thing. The teacher looked questioningly at the student. Yu Sheng continued. Today, he decided to fight for a just cause and get Moga's reward. The teacher said that if Moga didn't give him money after he saved the people, the teacher would give him the money himself. Yu Sheng took out his blade. The teacher asked about what he was going to do. The boy replied, "Isn't there any value in being evil?" He wanted to cut up the slain heretic and sell it. The teacher said that those who have recently turned are cheap and their meat is bitter. It would be better to leave it alone. The young man believed the teacher's words. The young man walked back towards the room. At this point, a man from the ministry approached the teacher. He told the teacher that he had resolved a small misunderstanding. The teacher asked if the man from the ministry could be relied upon, for they were old acquaintances. The man from the ministry said that he shouldn't delay the reward for Yu Sheng's certification. Otherwise, the boy would be furious. If he also found out that his teacher had taken the reward, the teacher agreed that the payment should not be delayed, or in a few years the young man might come and kill his teacher. The young man wandered around the factory. He saw the door of the monitor room, decided to go into it and have a chat with the captain. The captain knew the young man was coming. He was waiting for him, and as soon as Yu Sheng opened the door, the captain kindly invited him in. He invited the young man to meet him. After all, the last time the young man had been in this room, the captain had never introduced himself. His name was Wang Wenshuan. He exclaimed happily that they had settled everything today. The captain revealed that Yu Sheng had actually saved 2 people. He offered to trim the video recording. This could result in a double reward. Yu Sheng disagreed with the captain. He knew it couldn't be counted. Yu Sheng believed that the captain's job was to protect the students. Undercutting for the sake of money goes against the rules, and someone who doesn't follow the established rules would die very soon. After saying those words, the captain's face turned serious. He didn't think Yu Sheng had a thing for honesty. He was very surprised by this. The captain said all right, and he added that if they ever had to work together again, the young man should just call, for the captain was now his eternal patron, and whoever stood in his way of getting rich would die. Yu Sheng added that he had already repeated one speech many times. It is against the law to kill people outside the crime city, and if the captain even thinks of killing, Yu Sheng will report him to Moge. The captain laughed. He wasn't so determined anymore. Yu Sheng decided that he would think about who was better to work together with later. After all, the third paragraph of the Crime City Code says that you should never get close to idiots. And it doesn't matter if they're your friend or your enemy. It was already dawning outside. The factory no longer looked as gloomy as it had at night. In the room around the heretic's body sat the disciples. They were looking at him, looking fear in the eyes, assessing his wounds. They did everything their teacher told them to do. The captain walked through the doors. He was also a part-time school bus driver. The students rejoiced. They were happy that they were finally going home. The students got on the bus. Someone pushed Yu Sheng with an elbow. It was Zhao. He said that when they returned home, he would definitely help Yu Sheng with that case. The young man didn't immediately realize which case Zhao was talking about. Yu Sheng thought about it for a while and remembered. He had asked Zhao to increase his father's prison term. He said, "All right, mate." Zhao was happy that Shen allowed him to do that. Suddenly, someone took Shen's shoulder. It was Du Shu. He said he wanted to see Yu Sheng. He asked me to teach him how to kill. Shen hesitated for a moment. All of the disciples had a good heart. Why they all wanted to kill, that question was a mystery to him. After all, it was against the law. Yu Sheng thought that the people from the crime city were friendlier than the people around him now. After all, so little time has passed, and the disciples are already talking about killing. Du Shu said that he was not good with his tongue, and it was absolutely not what he wanted to say. He just wanted to become stronger. He thought Yu Sheng could help him become as strong as he was. Yu Sheng replied that one could go bald and become as strong as him. The students arrived at their school. Just as Yu Sheng got off the bus, the captain caught up with him. The captain asked the young man if they had a good rest at the performance review. Could it be called a rest? Probably not. Yu Sheng replied that he just got off the bus. The captain said that he was in no hurry, absolutely no hurry for him. Yu Sheng walked to the principal's office, grabbed the handle, and opened the door. Before he could even step inside, he blurted out that he had completed the task. Standing behind him was the captain. The principal said he had heard that before, but still, the results of the certification are not yet in. There's no specific list yet, and if it's a done deal, we need to wait until it's clearer. Yu Sheng turned to the captain and asked, in his opinion, in which place is he in? The captain enthusiastically replied that he was naturally in first place. After all, he was the only one who was able to defeat both the Hellhound and the Heretic. Therefore, he deserved to be honored and rewarded. The young man turned to the principal and said that he was now in first place. The principal was confused. He wondered why he was asking a complete stranger about the results of the performance appraisal. The director did not even know him personally and had never seen him before. The principal apologized. He questioned who the man who had come with Yu Sheng to his office was. The young man replied that the man was most likely from the province, and he probably decides everything at this assessment. The director realized that the man was from the provincial ministry. He happily gave his hand to the captain and began to apologize. The director was not even surprised that the young man was from the ministry. After all, the captain was young, promising, and also simply handsome. The captain was somewhat embarrassed by the director's words. The director said frustratedly that their place was practically without prospects. There is no money, no resources, and the only thing left is to watch the talents. Because they lack nothing, everyone lives as modestly as they can. The director inquired from which department such a high-ranking person was from. He ordered his secretary to bring tea quickly. The captain thought for a moment and replied that he was from the reserve. The girl had already brought the man freshly brewed tea. The director squinted his eyes. It surprised him that the man was from the reserves, and he immediately took the man's tea away from him. The principal with the tea stepped back. The captain and the secretary looked at each other in surprise. The director walked over to his seat. He put his hand on the chair and pushed it back. He asked why the man hadn't said he was from the reserves earlier. Yu Sheng was not interested in the conversation between the principal and the captain. He held out his hand and asked to give him what he had promised. The director held out several turquoise-colored crystals to him. Yu Sheng took and squeezed the stones in his hand. Having received the promised payment, he immediately left the principal's office. The captain followed the young man. Suddenly, a mobile phone rang in my pocket. Yu Sheng picked up the phone and replied. He got a call from Zhao. He called Shen his brother and said that his father was a very tough guy. Zhao went to see Shen's father today. But when he got to the prison, his father wasn't in his cell. He was sitting there guessing from the hand of a policewoman. It was very enviable. Yu Sheng tried to say something to his friend, but he cut him off at the half-word. Zhao continued. Since he considered himself very intelligent, under his guidance, his father's offense was successfully reclassified as committing lewd acts towards the female gender. With such a crime, he was facing a long sentence, and he wouldn't be able to get out of prison very soon. Yu Sheng rejoiced. Would his father really spend the rest of his life behind bars? The captain and Yu Sheng came to the main hall of the secret ministry. There were many people here. The captain asked to see it, for it was a division of the secret ministry. The captain asked the young man if it impressed him. The captain asked the young man if he would be taking pictures of anything here. There were girls sitting at tables and receiving visitors. The girl saw the captain in the room and was very surprised. She couldn't understand how he was here. The girl quickly grabbed the phone and called someone back. She said that Wang Wenruan, the sick Wang, had come to their ministry again. At that very minute, an emergency was declared. The girls started to lower the blinds. They put signs at their workplaces that the reception of citizens was temporarily suspended. The visitors were outraged because just a few seconds ago, the ministry was working, and now it was closed. Visitors were concerned about why it had closed. The captain and apprentice watched the situation unfold in surprise. Yu Sheng knew that talkers were not to be trusted under any circumstances. He had learnt that from the crime city. Since they are very chatty, they will talk at the most inopportune moment. A young girl approached the reception desk. She apologized and asked if she could speak to the girl from the ministry. She told her that their captain had gone on a mission. Many wounded men were now in the hospital. They were even willing to give a reward for his rescue. It was obvious that the girl was very excited, as she spoke in a raised tone of voice. The worker asked not to panic, but to give a detailed account of what had happened to the captain. It was necessary to get to the bottom of everything, and for that it was necessary to know the situation in more detail. The girl continued that they were now fighting heresy, and there was a reward for saving people. The girl had already switched to crying. If their captain dies, no one will survive. He is fighting for the human race. The girl worker raised her hand and said that it was necessary to wait a little while. She would have to check their policy. She put a book on the table, a political treatise, and started flipping through the pages quickly. She found the chapter she needed. And indeed there is such a rule. But in times of war, whoever has time must record a video. The girl handed the employee a flash drive. The worker got excited and picked up the flash drive. She quickly plugged it into her computer and opened it to view the contents. On the flash drive was a video of 3 armed men running at one. A fight broke out. Men with abrasions, bruises, and bumps were leaving the scene of the fight, and one man sat with his head bowed against the wall. The girl was already roaring. She asked for help with the mission, to delay the time, otherwise the captain would really die. The girl worker explained to the upset visitor that as much as she wanted to, she had no such rights. Suddenly, the girl rose from her chair. She asked to wait and ran after the supervisor. The captain was surprised. He didn't know it was possible to do that too, so he said the crazy woman had an idea. They are professionals, and they made the mistake of working together. The captain decided to take a risk because what one does for money. He started shagging and tearing his hair with his hands, and ran to the workers. He asked them to save their captain too. He had information that their captain was going to die too. There was practically nothing left of him. No arms, no legs, just his head. He asked the workers to give him a letter of recommendation. Otherwise, she would kill Guard Commander Bui Chuncheng, a reserve officer. He asked for help, tears streaming from his eyes. Xian Fan looked at his captain in surprise. Suddenly, the figure of a man appeared behind the captain's back. The captain was surprised. There was a tall man standing right behind him. His eyes were burning with a red light. Yu Sheng warned the captain that behind his back was the one the captain had spoken of a few seconds ago. The captain's face was surprised. He began to shout enthusiastically that his captain was brave and powerful. He can kill evil at a distance of 10 paces, and 1,000 paces around him, and there will be no one left at all. Could he really die? The girl worker said the captain is a jerk and he's next in line. The captain asked, according to the worker, would he survive with just his head? The captain turned round to his captain, whom he had summoned. It was fortunate that he had appeared at this very moment. They looked at each other in silence. The bus driver grabbed the man's arm. He wanted to explain everything to him. He began to tell the man something in his ear. It was clear that he was talking about Yu Sheng's exploits. The man asked incredulously, if this guy was as tough as the bus driver said he was, The captain was ready to sign every word he said. The tall man looked suspiciously at Yu Sheng. He somehow didn't immediately believe that he was a rich man. A man approached the young man, said hello, and extended his hand to him. His name was Sen and Mo. The man's name was very elegant. Sen and Mo said that he was not in the habit of talking a lot, but if Yu Sheng was offended by anyone in Baichuncheng, he asked them to tell him. He would be able to explain everything to the offenders in an easy-to-understand way. Yu Sheng replied that he doesn't really like fighting. What he likes most in the world is money. The man got excited and slapped his hand on his chest. He asked me to relax and look at him. He said that he gave his head that he would get the money today. To Yu Sheng, the man seemed more and more suspicious. The man said it was his turn and walked over to the girl who was standing by the table. He said that now it was his turn and he would definitely succeed. The girl looked at the man in black in surprise. She hoped that he would not interfere with her and would not spoil anything. A female employee appeared in the room. She had found the supervisor, and now they were going together to the girl to deal with the situation. The man in black quickly approached the executive, shoving the girl aside with his shoulder. He said that first, he and what was more likely they had already heard from his subordinate, that there was only one head left of him, and he would soon be dead. The executive looked at the man. He thought he was a demon war hero, but almost every day he was beating a drum. The supervisor asked him to wait while he sorted things out. He asked about the girl who was standing next to the man. The employee replied that it was the girl for whom the employee had followed the supervisor. The leader said that such a talented old and young generation came together here at the same time. Turned to the female worker. He realized that the girl had only recently arrived and did not know these faces. He asked her to remember these faces and to blacklist all of them, because they were fraudsters. The girl worker understood everything. The supervisor said they couldn't complete any of the tasks, but the man didn't wonder. He shouted that it was rubbish. After that, the man put his arm around Yu Sheng's shoulder. He asked the leader if he knew this guy. The supervisor had never seen this guy before. He asked who he was. The man introduced himself. He is Chen, and the MO is a reserve officer and commander of the Jiangbei Province Guards who has awakened 6 times. Compared to this, he has a higher status. He introduced Yu Sheng as his good friend. He said that the guy had spilled blood for the sake of humanity, killed evil things for the sake of humanity. The leader looked at the young man carefully. The leader replied that if he indulged these insolent people every day, he would rob Moje. No, he was not willing to do that. The man shouted that now everyone would see what he could do to him. The leader and the man were ready to fight, but they were interrupted by Yu Sheng. He coughed as he tried to draw attention to himself. He wanted to say a few words. Yu Sheng raised his index finger upwards and began his speech. According to the Mogi Penal Code, Awakened Chapter Article 9, those who fight in the city without any reason shall be punished by imprisonment for 15 days and a fine of 1,000 yuan. He who has a greater effect shall be punished by imprisonment for more than 6 months and a fine of 100,000 yuan for disturbing public order. The man was upset. 100,000 was not his order. Yu Sheng was ready to apply for the assignment, but if the supervisor delayed or did not accept it for any reason, he would have the right to guarantee his legitimate interests according to Article 32 of the Law on Protection of Rights. Yu Sheng sat up to the girl and said that he was on a mission. The captains stood to the side. They didn't understand what was going on with the young man, whether he was in his right mind now. Yu Sheng mentioned about the video. At this moment, the supervisor turned to the girl worker. He didn't understand why he should be given the task. The girl scrutinized the video of Yu Sheng fighting Heretic. Suddenly the girl said, "The video shows noticeable editing." Yu Sheng didn't mind. The video was indeed being edited, but it was easy to invite an expert to analyze the situation, as the forces were not equal at all. Yu Sheng reiterated that if it wasn't for his help, the students would have lost the fight. Suddenly, the supervisor ordered him to pass it and give all the reward according to the standard. The girl understood. The girl smiled and told the young man that the application had been submitted. Within 3 working days, the money would be deposited into the young man's account. Yu Sheng said thank you. He was curious to know the reason. The supervisor asked the young man if he was thinking of working in the secret ministry. Yu Sheng replied that he had no such plans yet. The leader introduced himself. He said his name was Lin. and he works as an assistant to the minister of Moge, Jiangbei province. He asked the boy to trust him, and after he entered the secret ministry, his career would not end. The leader held out a sheet of paper to the young man. A man in uniform joined the conversation. He said that the leader shouldn't even think about it. After all, he knew his intentions. After all, he had been a reserve officer for so many years. The leader turned and walked away. The officer only snorted indignantly. The officer told Yu Sheng that this time was a fluke. He asked him not to doubt his strength. Asked him to find him when Yu Sheng had money. The bus driver wanted to talk about money, but the man in uniform pulled him by the shoulder and asked him to leave. The captains headed towards the exit of the room. Yu Sheng remained seated on the chair near the table. The officer said it was a lot of chutzpah to want money in that situation. Yu Sheng headed to the school after that. He was met by Zhao on the school grounds. He shouted his name enthusiastically. Zhao was very happy that Yu Sheng had returned. After all, while he was away, the entire school's leadership had changed. It was their school that won the certification. The other two schools didn't agree, and there were riots every day. Zhao said that if Yu Sheng came back, everything would be fine, and they would definitely work things out together. Zhao had tears of joy in his eyes. Yu Sheng asked if he was willing to do that. Zhao chuckled and didn't reply anything. He also informed Shen that a teacher was looking for him. He was currently at the breakfast cafe across from the school. Yu Sheng wondered why the teacher was looking for him. He went to the cafe across the street to meet the teacher. The teacher was sitting at a table. A waiter came to his table to take his order. Yu Sheng walked over and asked why the teacher needed him. The teacher asked to see the waiter who worked in this cafe. Yu Sheng said that this is not the first time he sees this young man. He had heard that his classmates called this guy Limp Wang. The teacher asked as the boy looked at him, and brought a glass of coffee to his lips. Yu Sheng said, looking with his eyes. The teacher said that was correct, and he shouldn't have asked such a question. The teacher began to tell about the waiter. This young man was once an officer in the reserves. For 2 years, he had been in training. Then, because the summary data was insufficient, he went to the Dawn outpost. On the 3rd day, an unclean creature attacked him in the night and broke his leg. He had no choice but to come back here again. That's how it is. You can train for 2 years and not spend 3 days in a war. That's all Master wanted to tell Yu Sheng. After all, things were far from rosy for people now. The teacher talked and drank his drink leisurely. The teacher emphasized that war is cruel. He asked if Lame Wang had been attacked in front of Yu Sheng's eyes. Would he have saved him? Yu Sheng replied that he didn't know yet. The teacher said that he had once seen with his own eyes a rescued man point a knife at his savior. He also saw that 3 lives had been lost because of 1 bun stained with blood. The teacher got up from the table and said that perhaps he shouldn't force him. After all, the world had never protected Yu Sheng. The teacher put his hand on the young man's shoulder. Why is he making the boy go and protect the world? The teacher hesitated for a moment. At this time, Yu Sheng held a sharpened piece of metal in his hand at the ready. The teacher took his hands off Yu Sheng and suggested that we talk about something else. The teacher lit a cigarette and asked if Yu Sheng had any friends. The young man replied that he did. This is his friend, and she is now in a criminal city. But she will be out in 307 days. The teacher asked if this girl would be hunted by someone. What would Yu Sheng do in such a situation? The young man said he would kill anyone who hunted her. What if this girl is hunted by the whole world? Yu Sheng replied that then he would have to kill the whole world. The teacher turned his attention back to the waiter. He did the same, only he was protecting the whole world. The young man was surprised. He was protecting the whole world. And Yu Sheng was going to kill the whole world. The teacher had already finished his cigarette and threw it away. The teacher asked Yu Sheng to go to a place with him. Before leaving, the teacher stomped the cigarette butt with his foot. They came to the veterans camp. There were many people here. Some were without legs. A man came out to meet them. He said that the teacher thought this place was a zoo, but even so, he came here from time to time. He asked the teacher who he had brought to the veterans camp this time. The teacher replied that his student came with him. A man had a disc peeking out of his pocket. On the box was a picture of a naked girl. Yu Sheng immediately paid attention to this disc. The man said the student looked good. Yu Sheng bent down and said to the man directly in his ear, "According to the Moge Penal Code, the public sale of illegal videos is punishable by 15 days arrest and a fine of 2,000 yuan. The man did not immediately realize what the student meant. Yu Sheng showed the man 3 fingers and asked how much would be enough or not. The teacher wanted to call the student with him, but the man replied that he wanted to talk to the student some more. The man said that 30 is a lot. The young man replied that it did not mean 30 but 300. The man was outraged. He called the student a punk. He said he'd only bought 2 of them. He wanted to make some money. He raised his finger up menacingly. Yu Sheng knew exactly where such discs were sold. He coughed and said that these discs were sold in the north of Mobei at Brown's music shop. And he added that this shop sells 1 disc for 1 yuan. So, if you think about it, the man had another 800 of his earnings left. The man started to shake with anger. You could tell by the hands that the man was getting nervous. The man shouted out that 200 was the maximum he could offer. And if Yu Sheng didn't agree, he would tell Xiao Liu that he had absolutely no shame. Yu Sheng took out his phone at this time. Yu Sheng continued. He said that if he snitched this man to the right place, he could get 5,000. The man snatched the phone out of the young man's hands. He pressed it to his chest and said that with crooks, you can only cheat. And there's no need to bring in the bureaucrats. The man was just trying to make money for his wake. And he has a conscience after all. The phone kept ringing. He did not reset the incoming call. Someone's voice came through the receiver. The voice apologized and asked if Jung Yushu was really on the phone. The man shouted that he'd been wrongly challenged, and he was just showing off. How could he know the great hero Jung Yushu? As he did so, the man quickly pressed the end button of the call. After the man calmed down a bit, he replied that he agreed to 300, and yet they didn't even haggle. Yu Sheng was completely not serious about it. The man continued to hold the phone in his hands. The young man took the man's hand while doing so. The man replied that he was a hero. After all, he had guarded and subdued demons for 30 years. He had shed blood for people. After saying that, the man took money out of his pocket. He held it out to Yu Sheng. The young man took the money. Yu Sheng's teacher was watching their conversation. He was standing a little away from them. The teacher thought that Old Man Zhong really liked Yu Sheng. After receiving the money, Old Man Zhong and Yu Sheng went to the teacher. The man told the teacher that he had learned his student very well. The teacher thanked Old Man Young and said that he would try harder in the future. Old Man Young thought that everyone in the reserve was an idiot without exception, so he didn't listen to him at all. Yu Sheng hesitated for a moment. He gave Old Man Zhong some advice. You can actually change your management model a little, change the contents of the discs to anti-fraud, then there will be no need to worry. And after that, it would be possible to compete and make anti-fraud propaganda. Old Man Young was surprised. This guy knows a little about business. The man asked Yu Sheng if he had already awakened or not yet. The young man replied that it should happen this week. Old Man Zhong was very curious about exactly how many patterns Yu Sheng had discovered, but the boy remained silent. He didn't want to tell. The man turned his back on Yu Sheng and his teacher and started to leave. Lastly, he said that the young man was indifferent. He was very cautious. One must learn to trust those around him. The teacher and Yu Sheng continued on their way. They came to the trees where several graves were located. Another hole was dug next to them. The teacher said that Old Man Zhong's wife, son, and parents were buried here. Yu Sheng looked questioningly at the last dug hole. The teacher said that the last empty grave was for himself. He lives alone, and 2 rulers of the unclean world have been replaced under him. Teacher said that people actually live differently in reality. And he's absolutely not telling Yu Sheng to leave today. He's not. Except that the human race needs those who have enough strength to protect them. The teacher said that he really hoped that Yu Sheng would be that person, and he stroked the young man's head affectionately. Yu Sheng was alarmed by such actions of the teacher. It was evident that he clenched his fists tightly. The teacher also took notice. He was surprised that the boy didn't pull out the blade this time. It showed that the boy was beginning to trust his teacher. The teacher said that a crime city is just a crime city, and the world is very vast, and Yu Sheng should hear it, see it, feel it. The teacher gazed into the sky. The young man also looked up into the clouds. Old Man Young asked him not to play with his feelings and to get the hell out of here. After all, this was his family crypt, not a zoo. The young man and the teacher were surprised. At this time in the ministry, a man in a hoodie was on the phone. He was asking the divine servant to speed up the plan. He talked about how the last operation in Jiangbei province was too much. Even the Ministry of Expulsion of Uncleanness had joined the purge. They had suffered serious losses. The man continued to talk to the divine servant, After all, during the attestation, Jiang Bei is guarded the most, and if they decide to act, it could greatly affect their plan. The cloaked man replied that he had no further questions, apologized to the divine servant, and hung up. Since the divine servant was personally involved in the matter, he necessarily knew the plan to act on. It could be inferred that he did not require counselors in this matter. Yu Sheng stood in the principal's office. In front of his eyes was still the same scroll that appeared to him periodically. In the scroll, Yu Sheng read that his awakened item was a stick. Its strength tripled, its speed doubled, and its fighting ability increased tenfold. Following this, one should only strengthen the weaknesses. The headmaster snapped his fingers and brought the student back to the office, who was somewhere far away in his thoughts at the moment. The principal asked, "In the final exam, is there any guarantee that his results will be promoted 10 positions up?" Yu Sheng didn't know whether he had such guarantees or not. The director said there was no need to bargain. Yu Sheng looked at the headmaster, and in his mind was the thought that according to the rules of the crime city, you shouldn't be very confident if you don't know all the information. After all, otherwise you wouldn't be able to complete the task. The principal said that the threshold used to be 100. For every rise in the list, the principal would give the student a certain amount of money, and he wondered for a moment which amount would be more appropriate. The headmaster thought about it for a while. He'll give a student 100 each, and once they get to first place, he'll get 10000. Yu Sheng abruptly turned around, said goodbye to the principal, and wanted to leave his office. The headmaster jumped up abruptly from his chair and motioned for the young man to wait. The principal stood in front of the door and didn't want to let Yu Sheng out of his office until they came to a final decision that would suit them both. The principal said he had a dispute with the head of the education department, and if they rise to third place on the regional list, they will allocate funds to them. Then the principal and Yu Sheng could split them 70 to 30, and he asked how Yu Sheng felt about it. The young man thought for a moment. Yu Sheng said that going up the list and getting rewarded is certainly good. But wouldn't the director want to earn much more than this reward? The director thought for a moment. The headmaster stood in front of the door, thus blocking the student's exit. Yu Sheng turned around at this and walked back to the principal's desk. He suggested to the principal to improve his plan. The 3 students together could come up with a school uniform. The director needs to send his approval to the management, then make an advert on this form. Pupils from their school will get good seats and then give interviews in uniform. In doing so, they will become, so to speak, walking billboards. As a result, their school would achieve fame, and they would be happy to spend money on school uniforms. The principal was very surprised, for this was a Bible on making money. Yu Sheng, in the eyes of the principal, was an incredibly intelligent and bright young man. The headmaster asked him to trust him and not to worry at all, because the head of the education department, Mo Bei, was his good old friend from the war. The headmaster had the power to organize everything, as the student suggested. Yu Sheng asked the director if he was a reserve officer. The principal said that yes, he was a reserve officer. He didn't understand why the student needed this information. Yu Sheng decided that if the director was a reserve officer, he wasn't worth trusting. He remembered Old Man Zhong's words that only idiots came out of the reserves. In the director's office, the conversation continued. Yu Sheng asked about the method of dividing the money received. The director said that the division was very simple. Yu Sheng would be allocated 60. And that's quite generous. Yu Sheng pondered over the principal's words. He didn't agree with this outcome. The headmaster realized this and shouted at the whole office that he would give the young man 70 and keep only 30 for himself. The school's reputation should be added to this because only geniuses come out of here. The headmaster could not offer less because his connections also cost money. This result satisfied Yu Sheng. They agreed. The director ran to his desk. He said, "Okay, but you have to put a stamp on the contract. It should be written in black and white that the transaction was not made by words, but by documents." Yu Sheng said there was no need for a contract. He recorded the whole conversation on a dictaphone. After that, the young man walked out, banging the door loudly. The director hesitated. He just wanted money. Would Yu Sheng be able to report the director to the higher authorities with this record? It's been a week. Yu Sheng stood in the study and looked at the jacket. There were many labels on the back of the jacket. Data about the partners, the skills they possessed, and additional useful information. The principal was really generalizing, thought the student. Before the exam, Yu Sheng and Zhao were in the gym. They were fighting. Zhao begged Yu Sheng not to hit him. Zhao's face was already smashed and his nose was bleeding. He begged Yu Sheng to hit him even more slowly, letting him recover. Yu Sheng swung once again. Zhao prepared to strike and squinted his eyes. At this point, the blow came on the pair. The pair was held in front of him by Zhao. Zhao was indignant. He knew that Yu Sheng was kind, but it was also worth saying that he was in a lot of pain. The duel was being watched by Du Shu. The young man knew that he had transferred to this school for a reason. He, too, must improve his fighting ability. At this moment, Yu Sheng grabbed Zhao's leg and beat him against the floor. He threw Zhao from one side to the other. Zhao yelled to the whole gym. Du Shu could no longer watch this fight. He said that for the sake of the exam, he might as well intervene and rushed forward towards the guys. Zhao was foaming at the mouth, and Yu Sheng kept pulling him by the scruff of his shirt. Finally, Yu Sheng had finished. The bloody bodies of Zhao and Du Shu were lying on the floor. Yu Sheng went outside and stood under the wall of the school. At this moment, a teacher walked by the gymnasium. He asked Yu Sheng what he wanted. Here's what the young man thought. If the exam required him to fight, he didn't know how he should go about it. He didn't want to do it. The teacher asked if in this case he would shoot past or blunt his blade. Yu Sheng said that he would not do that, because you can't intentionally spoil a weapon. The young man asked the teacher why it was forbidden to kill people here, and who makes these rules. The teacher laughed, and once again touched Yu Sheng's head. The teacher observed the young man's hands while doing so. Yu Sheng stood at this, his hands in his pockets. The teacher asked if Yu Sheng remembered that veteran in the cafe. The teacher's hand was on Yu Sheng's head. The young man replied that he remembered. The teacher said he's going to veterans camp tomorrow too, because his only son had also passed into the reserves. The teacher said that lately Moga had been pushing him around all the time. They say his time has come, and he hasn't had any children. So in the near future, he will have to go to a veterans camp. But the teacher can enter Yu Sheng as his student, and that counts as a child, and that will allow him to stay. Yu Sheng agreed with the teacher. The teacher stared intently into the student's eyes. The teacher smiled at the student. They continued to stand opposite each other. The teacher and Yu Sheng approached the city gate of Mobei. This place was a busy place, with many people walking around. The teacher asked the student to think hard. After all, he had hardly any character problems. They approached the table. The young man sitting at the table had to fill out a questionnaire, and to do so, he needed to know the data. He asked Yu Sheng to give his name, age, identification number, his parents' name, and his chaperone. The disciple replied that his name was Yu Sheng, and he was 18 years old. The young man at the table clarified that the man accompanying the disciple was his father. Yu Sheng replied that his father had not come. The people around them were excited and frightened. They did not understand what had happened or where the explosion had come from. The teacher thought that the explosion had come from the direction where their school was. It was probably their school where it happened. The man who filled out the questionnaire shouted out that the heretics had mutinied. Their Moge had already sent men to deal with them. Everyone needed to calm down and get back to their business. The teacher said that Yu Sheng is the first in the province, and the teacher is waiting for him. Yu Sheng raised his hand, and energy swirled around him. People ran away in panic, yet the teacher was calm. The man blocked the teacher's path and said it was dangerous in the city, and he was not allowed to go inside. The teacher said that he was a Jiangbei reserve officer. He's been guarding a rebellion outpost for 2 years. It was his duty to protect the human race. A shining sword appeared behind the teacher's back. Since he is a teacher, it is his duty to protect his students. There were people crowded around the teacher. The man introduced himself that he was a reserve officer of Jiangbei, Unit 305, 140, first year of the new era, Dawn Outpost. One of the men also introduced himself that he was a Jiangbei reserve officer, 309 Squad, 145 AD, Demon Outpost. They kept repeating that it was their duty to protect the human race, and they were unreservedly ready to protect the people from heretics immediately. The man shouted after the teacher and some other men that it would not be so easy to pass. The man shouted after the teacher and some other men that it would not be easy to get through. The man thought that earlier, when people were attacked by demons, the defenders had stood to the end. Men in Macintoshes were already approaching the school building. There were many of them. The captain, who was the driver of the school bus, said that the heretics had indeed dared to attack the school. He warned everyone present to take action. One of the girls confirmed that we should act quickly. The girl with the chupa chupa suggested fighting to the death, as it would be quicker. Shouts were heard on the street. They were addressed to the servants of God of Mobe, Shinhai, Changchun, and asked for guidance. The captain said since Moge wasn't here right now, he would lead the troops in his place, and he called for the start. He wanted to end the battle in 5 minutes. But those who disobeyed his orders, whether alive or dead, would have their heads flung off their shoulders. Suddenly, the captain heard someone addressing him. The voice said that the kid who had barely joined the reserve was already such an idiot. These words were spoken by a teacher at the school. There was another officer behind the teacher, and he said he remembered this child. He was beaten every day in the army, and he cried a lot. Oh, now this kid is very grown up. The captain was distracted for a moment and laughed. At that moment, the officer knocked the captain to the ground. The captain fell to the floor. The teacher said it was enough to be distracted for just a second and you could be beaten, and called the captain a loser. The teacher, sword in hand, stood in front of the heretics. Behind him stood a group of people. The heretics came very close to him, and the master asked everyone to listen to his command. He called for the gates to be blocked to prevent more casualties. He said he had brought men who could protect the school. The battle began. The heretics were armed and strong. This was happening in the city, and the camp was quiet and peaceful. At this time, Jun was fishing and watching the float. The float would occasionally twitch. Most likely the fish would swim up to the bait. Footsteps were heard behind him. Someone was carefully approaching the lake. And someone called out to him loudly. It was the leader. Old man Jun shuddered. He was enjoying fishing and didn't expect to be disturbed by someone near the lake. He asked what happened. Did someone die? And said that the leader had really frightened him. Jun sat still and held the fishing rod in his hands. He continued to watch the float. It felt like he didn't care about anything at all at this moment. The leader made a request to him. Lin Feng from the 4th generation asked him to return from his reclusive life. Jun exhaled a sigh of relief. He thought that Mai Di himself had appeared. He had asked the leader to leave because he had absolutely no intention of returning. He was quiet and peaceful here, and he didn't plan to fight for peace again and protect people from evil. Jun said that if he showed up at the outpost with the level he has now, he would be blown away. He no longer has the strength he had 10 years ago. He's slowly losing his skills. And he just doesn't want to be a part of it. After all, most likely there are younger guys who can defend against evil. The leader pleaded. He narrated that since the Qi had appeared, the 1st generation had almost completely perished. There were very few people left of the 2nd generation. At the same time, the 3rd generation is holding the front very weakly. He is needed in the city. Without him, the outpost to subdue the evil can't hold out. Jun replied, no matter what happens, he's not ready to get involved because he's already too old. The leader took out a box of some kind. It was small and brown in color. He begged, pleaded with the Honorable Zhong to return from his reclusiveness. The leader opened the box he was holding in his hands. In the box was an orange-colored orb. The orb looked like a pearl. Jun turned around and looked back at what the leader was offering him. He clarified that if he ate it, his body would be the same as before. He also said that they really went to a lot of trouble. At that, his face became visibly cheerful. He wasn't so adamant anymore, which meant he was open to the idea of going back to town. The manager said that Mobe had been attacked. At the same time, the city itself is in turmoil. If Jun doesn't help restore order, he'll just witness the loss of life. There's an invasion of heretics in the city. There are so many of them, and the defenders can't fight them all. Jun wondered, is the leader really threatening him with the lives of ordinary people? The supervisor said that he would agree to any of Jun's conditions. After all, he was fighting for Mobe. He had nothing else to offer. The supervisor knelt down in front of Jun. Jun turned around and picked up the box the leader held out to him. He sighed. He simply had no other choice. He must help. It was his duty. Jun turned around. Someone asked him a question. Would their pillar of the human race return? Behind him were 3 young men dressed in black cloaks. The youths repeated with one voice, "The teachings of the 1,000 gods, the servants and protectors of gods, greet the Honorable Jun." These were the heretics who had attacked Mobe. Jun wondered if there were heretics standing in front of him. Bringing these 3 with him was not enough. The heretics replied that it was completely irrelevant. And if Jun ate this medicine, then within 3 days, the demons would start a large-scale battle for the outpost of pacifying the unclean. Jun said that the guys were just talking rubbish to scare him. He took the medicine from the box in his hands. At that moment, flashes flashed. The heretics watched carefully to see what Jun would do. Jun brought the medicine to his lips and put it in his mouth. He swallowed it quickly. The man didn't even need to wash it down with water. The capsule was small in size. At that moment, flashes began to flash. A magic spear appeared behind the man's back. It was his secret weapon that appeared when he needed to fight. Jun felt a surge of strength. As it turned out, he wasn't that old. The heretic shouted something about the 8th Bodhi, and that it can't be. Even if Jun recovers, he still needs the 7th Bodhi. Jun replied that they had worked hard to hide their spy in Moje. The heretic was puzzled. He didn't understand how Jun had guessed. He squinted his eyes. Meanwhile, Jun stood looking at the heretics. Behind him, a force that was represented as a hand took a spear. Zhang replied to the heretic that he had said enough, and it was time for him to say goodbye to this world. The hand began to unwind the spear right in front of the heretics. Another second, and the heretics were struck by the spear. Blood spurted in all directions. Some of the heretics were bleeding from their mouths. It was not a sight for the faint of heart. After the fight, Jun approached the still slightly alive heretic. The heretic was lying in a pool of blood and was beating in death convulsions. Out of his last strength, he asked that before he died, if Jun could answer one question he had. But Jun replied that he couldn't and he didn't have time to talk to him. The heretic said goodbye to his life in the same second and fell to the ground. His body was already breathless. Jun turned to the supervisor. He told him to call Chenmo and tell him to get the nets. It was as if the manager didn't realize what he had been told. He asked in surprise. Then Jun once again asked to just call him, and the leader took out his phone to make the call. The supervisor dialed a number. He introduced himself as Jun and asked to take out the nets. The voice on the other end of the line understood, as if it had been waiting for this call. Jun crouched back down on the spot where he had previously been fishing. The supervisor was outraged that the man continued to fish in such an environment. Jun launched the float across himself while doing so. He clarified, "Did they all come out such idiots from Linnan Academy?" Jun stood up and began to walk away from the lake. As he walked away, the man waved his hand at the leader, as if urging him to follow him. Then he called out in a voice to the leader to follow him, saying that it was time to settle the score. All those who were in the camp at that time began to sob. They realized that their master Jun might not return to them again, and they were in great pain at that thought. They were used to him and didn't want to let their master go. After all, anything could happen to him. Demons were treacherous and underhanded. On the other hand, only Jun could protect all humans. Jun replied that if his old bones could still serve humanity, it would be worth it. He set off into the distance. The veterans looked at their lord until he disappeared. Meanwhile, Yu Sheng made his way to the examination venue. He walked leisurely, completely calm. In his hands, he was holding a loaded crossbow. He was always much calmer when he had some sort of weapon in his hands. As he approached the exam site, he saw several creatures. They looked like wolves. They had sharp claws on their paws and thick brown fur on their bodies. After analyzing the appearance of the creatures, he decided that there was no way to kill them with a crossbow. And just then, he thought of the stick. Just then, a stick appeared in his hands. It came out of nowhere and emitted light. Yu Sheng realized that he had awakened, and now it was his secret weapon. At this minute, the monster's eye spotted Yu Sheng. The monster jumped up and flew straight at the young man. It had long, sharp claws. Its mouth was open. White teeth came out of it. Its eyes burned with a turquoise light. The boy was not frightened and was ready to take the blow, for by now he had already awakened. Yu Sheng held the magic stick firmly in his hands. It was also emitting light. He pointed the stick at the monster flying in the air. Yu Sheng hit the monster with a stick. The monster became dizzy. Its pupils started rolling in circles. At this moment, the young man pulled out his blade and swung it. Yu Sheng was always ready for battle, so he carried an arsenal of weapons that he expertly hid under his clothes. As the monster flew up, the young man stabbed it in the chest with his blade. Scarlet blood flew to the sides. The beast roared. Yu Sheng liked this attack. It was very effective. The blade had saved him more than once in difficult situations. Yu Sheng looked around. There were many monsters in the neighborhood. Their eyes were sparkling with red light. In the middle of the clearing was Yu Sheng's stick, which was emitting light. And the closer the creatures got to it, something strange began to happen to them. Their eyes began to spin. It was a kind of hypnosis. They'd stare at the stick without taking their eyes off it. It was as if they didn't notice the young man behind them. At this moment, Yu Sheng pushed himself off the ground and jumped at the monsters. He swung his blade around him. He mercilessly slashed the monsters around him. Blood flew in all directions. Yu Sheng fought them all night long. The battle ended at dawn. The bloody bodies of the monsters were scattered at the edge of the forest. Scarlet bloodstains were everywhere on the grass. The young man stopped the moment he was sure that all the animals were dead. He stood at the edge of the forest, holding a blade in one hand. At that moment, a bird flew in. It landed on a tree not far from Yu Sheng. The bird caught the young man's attention. Another second and the flock of birds flew straight at the young man. Yu Sheng was ready to attack again. He held his blade at the ready. Yu Sheng started swinging his blade around himself. He slashed the birds one by one. Yu Sheng realized that these weren't ordinary birds. This was most likely another stage of the exam. Blood flew in different directions, and the breathless birds fell to the ground one by one. The man stood on a tree branch and was surprised that the animal spirits had already died. It happened in a very short period of time, only 15 minutes. He could not understand how it happened. Everything that was happening in the forest, the man saw on the map. He saw a red dot that was moving. It was Yu Sheng. He was surprised because someone was already approaching the finish line. It was unbelievable if it was the same Yu Sheng. How did he do it? The man was very surprised. Could it be that after so many years, the trouble would finally leave Jiangbei? Yu Sheng was in a great hurry to get somewhere. He was practically flying above the ground through the trees in the forest. He wanted to move as fast as possible and was doing his best to do so. Yu Sheng wanted to get out. He needed to see something urgently. Suddenly he stopped. His path was blocked by another beast that looked like a tiger. It was large in size. The young man was ready to fight it too. He held his blade firmly in his hand. Yu Sheng thought for a moment. Some kind of plan appeared in his mind. What was the right thing to do, and what weapons to use? He quickly unzipped his jacket where the needles were attached. Yu Sheng instantly snatched them up and threw them at the enemy. The needles reached their target, stabbed the animal and fell down, but they did not do much damage to the animal. Such an incident just made the monster very angry. Its eyes became bloodshot. Yu Sheng acted further. He was well prepared and had different weapons. After all, one could not know in advance which weapon would be the most effective in a particular case. He quickly wrapped a string around his fingers, making a bowstring like a bow. And now the sharply sharpened arrow was flying at high speed straight at the monster. The arrow stabbed into the monster's neck. This weapon was more effective as blood appeared. The tiger was wounded. The pain made him growl fiercely. The monster came closer to the young man and swung its paw. Yu Sheng jumped up and dodged the blow. He was holding a rope in his hands. The moment the beast wanted to attack Yu Sheng, the guy wrapped the cable around the animal's neck. The young man flew over the tiger and forcefully tightened the rope with both hands. Blood flew out of the beast's mouth. Yu Sheng was able to deal with this beast as well. The breathless tiger fell to the ground. Another ordeal was over. Yu Sheng was very happy that it was finally over. He was a little tired from the fights and wanted to rest. Yu Sheng was determined. He said that when he came out, he would definitely see his teacher Lu, whether he would be alive or dead. The man watched the young man with astonishment. Yu Sheng was clothed in a glow. The man watching the exam could not believe his eyes. It was only 20 minutes and someone had already managed to escape from the trap. Yu Sheng had already arrived at the place and was just standing by the table. He asked the man what seat he had taken. The man replied that he was the first. It's not known for sure if it's province-wide or not, but in Mobe, Yu Sheng is the first. The young man turned round and was about to leave. The man asked where he wanted to go. Yu Sheng replied that he was going to the city. The man blocked the passage and said that it was very dangerous in the city right now. At the same time, Yu Sheng is injured, and the first thing to do is to deal with it. The young man pointed a loaded crossbow at the man's face. He said that if the man tried to interfere with him again, he would kill him. The man stood his ground. He said that in that case, Yu Sheng would have to kill him. because he can't let the young man enter the city. He's responsible for Yu Sheng's life. Yu Sheng didn't understand. Is this man really completely unafraid of death? Or is he just pretending and playing a stage? The young man pulled out a gun and pointed it at the man. He said that he was not ready to pay such a price. At that moment, an arrow from the crossbow flew into the ground. Yu Sheng thanked the man for his concern and said that he was responsible for his own life. And once again, he asked him not to interfere, otherwise he would really have to kill him. At that moment, there was a battle with heretics in the city. The girl was desperately pushing back the heretics with her foot. The captain was also striking the heretics. Blood was flying around. The girl struck one of the heretics in the chest with an axe. Blood gushed from his chest. The girl was holding a glowing axe in her hands. She killed the heretics one by one with powerful blows. The men fell to the ground from their injuries, which were incompatible with life. A little further on, the heretics piled up in a heap. You could see someone scattering them to the sides. Men in cloaks flew from the center in different directions. Everyone rolled up their sleeves and fought desperately against the evil. A young girl was ruthlessly slaughtering heretics. Her face was covered with abrasions and blood, but she looked brave and courageous. A little further away, a captain and a dark-haired girl were fighting back to back. They were all covered in the blood of heretics. There were so many of them, it was like an invasion. The captain waved the glowing axe, keeping the heretics at a safe distance and keeping them away. But the man in the cloak was getting too close. He looked straight into the captain's eyes. The captain swung the axe desperately in front of the heretic's eyes. The man grimaced and tried to evade the blow. Suddenly, the man in the cloak dodged and began to struggle with the captain. The heretic threw the captain to the ground with force. Blood flew from his mouth. When the heretic saw what had happened, a dark-haired girl with a sword flew up to the heretic. She raised the weapon high above her and struck. The sword stabbed into the heretic's back. He cried out. The captain lay on his back and watched in amazement. Had he at this moment allowed the girl to save him? The axe lay on the captain's chest. The captain rose to his feet and swung his axe. The heretics were very numerous. They were coming and coming. They were coming like the unclean. The captain shouted that they would not be able to stop them. The girl hoped that they would be able to protect the students and other civilians that were in the city itself. The heretics raised their heads to him and uttered their cry again. They asked the gods to come with them. The principal and a teacher were standing on the school grounds. They were watching what was happening. The teacher had a huge sword on his shoulder. The men realized that there was no way to stop the evil at the gate. The teacher said that now it was their time, and they had to hold out at all costs until reinforcements arrived. The heretics began to get close to the teacher. A fight broke out. The teacher swung his sword mercilessly and cut down everyone in his path. The heretics groaned and screamed in pain, but continued to advance. The teacher fought desperately against the enemy. They must protect their school, their city, and the heretics no matter what. Blood splattered to the side. Hundreds of students were visible in the windows. They were watching what was happening. Their faces radiated surprise, interest, fear. The principal was outside. He saw the students watching what was happening. He said that today, the headmaster would teach them an important lesson. Whoever dares to attack his men will surely be punished. The headmaster said that in his years, he too had passed the outpost of pacifying the evil. And at that second, a sword appeared behind his back. The sword was glowing red, and its hilt was decorated with blood-red stones. He took this sword in his hands. Now he is definitely ready to face the evil one. He called the heretics bastards. And he said that no matter how much they wanted to, they would not dare touch his disciples. Let it remain only in their dreams. And the headmaster began to bravely swing his sword around. Where the sword passed, a blood-red trail was left behind. The teacher stood not far from the principal and waved his sword. The teacher hadn't had so much fun in a long time. He was fighting heretics while still being joyful and cheerful. The director said that destroying the sect is to protect the future of the human race. It's just like 10 years ago. It's happening all over again. And their task is to stand up to the evil again. The principal quoted the teacher's words about protecting the future of the human race. He said it was really funny. One of the sect leaders appeared as a bird. He had his own wings and was also supported by a red bird. He said that to cleanse the world of evil and build a new order for the people would mean to give people a new future. The director objected. Their sect didn't care about people at all. He's a vile brat who only knows how to seduce young people." The man-bird raised his hands in the air. He said that all that was needed was for light to shine on the earth, and then people could live forever in unity with the gods. And he repeated that ignorant people can't understand that. He thought the headmaster and the teacher were ignorant. At that moment, the teacher joined the conversation. He said that if the leader's words didn't make sense, then we should start fighting. The teacher was ready to fight the demon. The ringleader smiled. He liked the teacher's straightforwardness very much. He flapped his wings and flew over the school, going to fight the teacher. Behind him were streaks of red light. As he flew closer, the ringleader told the teacher that he had a great sword. The teacher replied that his sword was very good. He likes it very much too. After all, it helps him to fight against evil. Besides, the sword has a rather euphonious name, Devil's Gravedigger. It has sent dozens of heretics and other evil things to the other world. The teacher swung his sword near the leader of the undead. He was ready to attack him. The male bird scoffed. He regretted that many people might die from the sword today. The man ran away from the teacher with lightning speed. He anticipated his actions and evaded the blow. The ringleader began to laugh. It didn't sound like laughter, but a devilish regurgitation. He said that eventually a divine light would shine on this world, and called humans dirt on its surface. He called for the gods to arrive with them, and asked that the divine light be eternal. He said those words again. He asked it from the sky, from the universe. He raised his hands to the sky, pushed off the ground, and flew upwards. He headed towards the school building. The teacher was watching him closely. After analyzing the words he had said, the teacher realized that his main goal was the students, and this could not be allowed to happen. As a teacher, he had a duty to protect them. He was responsible for every student who attended their school. The teacher looked at the departing ringleader with his gaze. He asked that it be left to him. He personally wanted to deal with this ringleader. The master raised his sword high. At that instant, the ringleader was just flying over the teacher. The teacher crouched down a little. He wanted to accelerate and attack the devilish bird. He pushed himself off the ground and flew upwards. The teacher was in the air. He was practically on the same level as the ringleader. The teacher asked, dismissing even the thought of approaching the students. After all, he would not allow it, no matter what it cost him. He would stand to the last man. After all, he is an officer, a teacher, a protector, and it is his duty. The teacher struck the flying heretic leader with his spear. He covered himself with his wings. The ringleader fell to the ground with a noise. The impact was very powerful because pieces of the pavement flew in different directions. After hitting the ground, he was still alive. The man slowly got up. He said that this time the teacher had made him very angry. At that moment, a teacher flew up to him. He shouted that no one cares about his mood, and he was really annoying. The hands holding the sword were behind his head. The teacher was in full readiness to strike again. The teacher lowered his sword and struck the ringleader with it. The teacher was now looking at him in surprise. He did not immediately realize what was happening. The ringleader caught the blow with his wings, and only a few feathers flew from them. He laughed and said that after death the teacher could have a divine body. The teacher stared in surprise at what was happening to the birdman. The teacher was angry. He was also confident in his own abilities. The teacher sat down for a few seconds to catch his breath. He thrust his sword into the ground. He leaned on his weapon to keep his balance. At the same time, the ringleader took off all of his feathers and now looked like a scarf of feathers. The ringleader no longer had wings. He looked almost like a normal human being. The leader swung round and threw those feathers with incredible force straight at the teacher. They were no longer feathers, but a blob of fiery energy, like a laser beam. The beam was coming lightning fast towards the teacher sitting on the ground. The teacher saw it and prepared to take the blow. The teacher was not afraid. He looked the enemy straight in the face. He was ready to take the blow. The teacher got up from the ground and prepared to take the blow. He also gathered all his remaining strength to strike his opponent as well. In response to the ringleader's actions, the teacher threw a stream of his power and energy right at him. It looked like a beam of energy, only it was already light. The teacher bravely took the blow. The blow went straight to his chest. The teacher clenched his teeth in pain. The blob of energy that the teacher threw reached the ringleader. It hit him squarely in the chest and knocked him to the ground. Scarlet blood appeared on his shirt. He was stunned. Perhaps the blow had hit him right in the heart. Though whether the undead have a heart is a big question. The teacher could defeat the heretic leader. He had succeeded. Blood was trickling from the man's mouth. His face was turning blue. The leader was slowly losing his life force. He didn't expect this turn of events. He wanted to be the winner. But it happened as it happened. In this fair fight, good defeated evil. The fight was over. It took place right in the square in front of the school building. All the students saw how desperately their teacher defended them. The evil was defeated. The leader of the heretics slowly descended to the ground. The teacher's body was covered with many lacerations. Blood was oozing out of them. There were hematomas on his face. He stood holding his heart with his hand. The teacher repeated once again that whoever attacked his men would surely be punished. The last blow was very strong, and it took almost all of the teacher's life force. The teacher crouched down. With one hand he leaned on his sword, which was driven into the ground. He was exhausted and wounded, but he was still trying to keep his balance. At this second, the teacher noticed a familiar silhouette. Could it really be Yusheng? The teacher could not believe his eyes. He thought he was already dead and was hallucinating. Where could the student have come from? The young man came closer and closer. He was already standing next to his teacher. The teacher could not believe it. It was really his student, and he was standing next to him. Yusheng knelt down in front of the teacher. He told him about his success in the exam, and that he had won first place in Mobe. But what place he had taken in the province, he didn't know yet. The teacher was proud of him. He said that always in his eyes, the young man was the best. Yusheng was indignant, after all. His teacher was now dying before his eyes. The teacher intermittently replied that death might be liberating. The teacher took out his lucky amulet from his pocket. He knew that Yusheng was the one who was worthy of possessing it. He said that this amulet was his pride. With this amulet, Yusheng would be able to prove that he was part of the hero family. After all, the teacher had long considered the young man a member of his family. The young man took the amulet and looked at it. The teacher said that he had always protected the young man at school. After all, he was from a crime-ridden city. The teacher reached out his hand to the young man's head. His hand was shaking. The teacher was losing strength every second. Yusheng quickly bent over, and the teacher placed his hand on his head. He had done this many times before, but at this moment, the teacher was saying goodbye to his student forever. It was a very touching scene. He asked the disciple to never let anyone ever change himself. Always be himself and do what he thinks is right. Always have your own personal opinion and listen to your heart. The teacher said he saw a bright light, and it was time for him to leave. He was very glad that he had spent the last seconds of his life with his best student. After all, he was different. He was different from everyone else. The teacher repeated the word light again. Yusheng didn't understand what he was talking about. The young man didn't see any light around him. The teacher slowly lowered himself to the ground. The teacher sat down on the ground and bowed his head. Next to him, his sword, which had served him faithfully, was stuck in the ground. Yusheng sat opposite the teacher and knelt down. Yusheng was in a lot of pain right now. He was not soulless as he seemed to many people. Tears were streaming down his face. He had never cried before. At this moment, he was remembering the best episodes of his school life that involved the teacher. He remembered his wise advice. At that moment, he became even stronger. He was furious at all the evil that had appeared. For killing his teacher, he shouted that they would all die, and he clutched his blade tightly in his hand. He ran up to the heretics and furiously began swinging his blade. He slashed, mercilessly slashing the heretics with his blade. Blood splattered to the side, but the boy was unstoppable. It was as if a demon had possessed him. His gaze was as angry as ever. He believed he had the power to avenge and stop this invasion. He killed heretics one by one. He stabbed the bodies through and through. He did it quickly and ruthlessly. The girls who had fought against the evil before, as well as the captain, looked at the young man in surprise. How this fragile boy had so much anger, so much power and hatred. The captain didn't know what to think. He didn't understand what had happened to Yusheng. After all, they had interacted with him many times, and he had always been calm and composed. And now, this disciple was coldly and brutally slashing everyone around him, not stopping for a second to take a breath. By this time, June had arrived. He couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't believe that this could have happened. Surrounded by the dead bodies of heretics sat the teacher. The teacher sat still and did not move. His eyes were closed. His body was covered with wounds. By this time, he was already dead. It seemed like only recently they had met at the camp. Jun was only a little late, and here such a thing had happened. Jun was very angry at the heretics. After all, those bastards had killed his good friend. So he prepared his spear. It emitted light and energy and was fully ready for battle. Jun struck the ground with force with his spear. Sparks flew all around. His eyes flashed with a fierce fire. He promised old Liu that he would definitely avenge him. It was his duty now. And he started waving the spear around himself. It was like a light show. The dead heretics were flying in different directions. A monster of some kind was watching, hiding behind the trees. Its eyes were glowing with a red light. The monster was surprised to see Old Man Chuzan here. The monster came out from behind the trees, opened its mouth, and began to hiss. It was a huge snake. It must have been another test for the awakened. It rose directly above the captain. The monster was taller than the trees and taller than the school. The captain knew at once that this was their plan. First, the heretics had destroyed their main force, and now the Demon King himself had appeared at the ready. But one fact they hadn't considered was that Old Man Jun would be here. Jun looked at this beast and said that the 6-star Demon King had decided to give him a gift upon his return to his post. It looked really good. Jun was fully prepared to fight the demon. He looked calm and fearless. The demon spoke to Jun. He called him an old wreck. He warned him that if he was able to kill the king then, it did not mean that he would be able to defeat the Demon King again. Jun said that the demon was talking rubbish. Today, he is willing to repay the demon for spilling the blood of humans, for his good friend Liu, and also to prevent more human deaths. Jun pushed himself off the ground with force. He wanted to gain acceleration. He flew straight at the demon. At that, his spear was in front of him. The demon opened its jaws and tried not to let the man out of its sight. Jun struck the demon with force just below the eyes. There was a bright flash as the monster and the spear made contact. The snake looked angrily at the man and said that so many years had passed, but Jun Yushu had not become stronger at all. She acted as if the man had not harmed her at all with his blow. The demon waved his head and forcefully threw Chuzan backwards. The man with the spear flew in the other direction. It was difficult to fight such a majestic demon, but still possible. The main thing was to be a little smarter and more dodgy, and also to calculate every move you make. Jun landed on his feet, but since he was still in motion, he tried to brake with his feet and stop. The demon arched its neck and tried to get closer and closer to the man. The snake crawled closer and closer to Jun. It wanted to kill the man quickly. But that wasn't the case. Jun shouted out that the demon could keep the previous king company underground. They both knew what had happened to the previous demon king. He had been killed precisely by Jun's hands. At this moment, he swung. His spear was enveloped by an unknown force that glowed with blue flames. Jun held the spear with his strong hands, and he tried to attack the demon again. But the demon whipped its head round again and shoved the man aside. Jun launched his spear at the demon the moment he flew with force. He couldn't get any closer with the spear. Therefore, throwing his weapon was the perfect option. The throw was powerful and accurate. It hit the target. The spear hit him in the torso. It was a deadly blow. The demon opened its mouth, hissing and wriggling. It was probably in a lot of pain. This strike was the decisive blow. Jun had masterfully calculated where the demon was most vulnerable. The demon staggered and fell to the ground with a clatter. Jung didn't expect that he could defeat the Demon King so quickly. It was a pity that Old Man Liu didn't see this fight. Jun knew that he dedicated this fight to him. He had avenged the Evil One's arc, thus saving many human lives. Jun turned around and said menacingly, "In order not to shame the spirit of a hero, it is only necessary to destroy all the uncleanness." The uncleanness was defeated just as it had been 10 years ago. Peace and tranquility returned to the land.